Don't touch anything else. My husband took the glass right out of my hand. I actually laughed. Not because Daniel was being funny. Daniel has many fine qualities, but spontaneous comedy has never been one of them. I laughed because 5 seconds earlier, I'd been standing on Rick's patio, drinking sangria and listening to Daniel's cousin Marty explain why Maryland property taxes were apparently a personal attack on him. Nothing about the afternoon had suggested I was about to receive instructions from a federal agent. What? Daniel held the glass away from me. His face made me stop smiling. You didn't see who handed you that? Of course I did, Scott. I turned toward the drink table. Scott wasn't there. That was strange because he'd been standing beside me maybe 30 seconds earlier. Melissa had brought him over when we arrived, and then disappeared into the house to help Evelyn with something. I'd met Scott twice before. He was 48, neatly dressed, good teeth, easy smile, the kind of man who remembered your name and made you feel slightly guilty for forgetting his. He'd approached carrying 2 glasses. Claire, right? That depends. Are you selling something? He'd laughed. I figured you might need rescuing. He nodded toward Marty, who was explaining assessments now. You may have saved my life. Scott handed me the sangria, then came the questions. How was work? Was I still with the school district? Was Emily living in Washington now? Did Daniel still travel a lot? Did I usually beat him home in the evenings? Nothing had sounded odd at the time. People ask questions at family gatherings because the alternative is discussing the weather or somebody's knee replacement. Now Daniel was holding my glass with a napkin wrapped around it. Where did he go? He asked. I don't know. Claire, get Emily. Daniel, get your purse too. We're leaving. I stared at him. Your mother spent 3 weeks planning this reunion. I know. And we've been here 40 minutes. I know. Then tell me what's happening. His eyes moved past me toward the yard. 30 relatives were scattered around picnic tables and folding chairs. Kids were playing cornhole near the fence. Rick was at the grill arguing with somebody about whether hamburgers could be medium rare without becoming a public health event. Everything looked normal. Daniel leaned closer. Claire, please, just this once. That got me moving. You have to understand something about my husband. Daniel had been with the FBI for more than 20 years. He was careful about work, and I respected that. I never asked him questions I knew he couldn't answer, but sometimes that professional habit followed him through our front door. A phone call would come during dinner. What happened? Work. He'd cancel a weekend. Why? Can't get into it. After 19 years of marriage, can't get into it. Had become the third person in our relationship. Still, Daniel rarely said please when that look came over his face. I found Emily near the kitchen. She was 22 and had recently reached the age where she considered family reunions something to endure in exchange for free food. Grab your bag, I told her. Why, your father? She nodded. That was apparently sufficient explanation. On our way out, I glanced toward the side of the house. Scott was there, so was Rick. They were standing close enough that they clearly weren't discussing baseball. Rick said something I couldn't hear, Scott answered. Then Rick looked toward the patio and saw me watching. He immediately stepped back. Scott turned too. For 1 second, our eyes met. Then Daniel touched my elbow. Car. We left without saying goodbye to Evelyn, which I knew we'd pay for later. Daniel drove. I sat beside him. Emily was in the back. We made it maybe 2 miles before I said start talking. What exactly did Scott ask you? That's your explanation, Claire. I repeated the conversation. Work, Emily. Daniel's travel. When I got home, Daniel's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. I noticed. So those weren't innocent questions. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. From the back seat, Emily said he asked me about Grandma. Daniel looked at her in the mirror. What did he ask? Whether she still lived alone. The car got very quiet. I turned around when before lunch. I thought he was making conversation. So did I said. Daniel didn't say anything. That bothered me more than if he had. When we got home, Emily went upstairs and I followed Daniel into the kitchen. All right, no more questions about what Scott asked. Tell me why you took that glass. Daniel set his keys on the counter. I've seen him before. Where? He hesitated. That was enough. Work? Yes. What does that mean? It means I recognize him from something connected to work. Is he dangerous? I don't know. I stared at him. That is becoming your favorite answer, because right now it's the truthful one. You just pulled a drink out of my hand in front of 30 people. I know. You rushed our daughter out of a family reunion. I know. And now I'm supposed to be satisfied with I don't know. No, that answer surprised me. Daniel rubbed a hand over his face. I'm trying to figure out what I can tell you without saying something I shouldn't. Then figure it out quickly, because you don't get to scare me and classify my own life. His expression changed a little. Fair. The doorbell rang. Daniel and I looked at each other. He went to the door. Melissa walked in before he had it fully open. What the hell is wrong with you? Daniel closed the door behind her. Melissa, no. You text me, tell me not to leave with Scott, and then refuse to explain why I told you I'd call. You also disappeared from Mom's reunion with Claire and Emily like somebody yelled fire. She looked at me. Are you okay? I think so. You think so? Welcome to my afternoon. Melissa turned back to her brother. I knew you didn't like him. This isn't about whether I like him. You've met him twice. Daniel's voice stayed calm. What name did he give you when you met? She frowned. What his full name? Scott Mercer. Daniel didn't respond. Melissa folded her arms. Why are you asking me that? He looked at me once then back at his sister. That's not the name I know him by. Melissa's arms slowly dropped to her sides, and for the first time since she'd stormed through our front door, she had nothing to say. Melissa stared at Daniel. What do you mean that's not the name you know him by? Daniel pulled out one of the kitchen chairs. Sit down. Oh, absolutely not. You don't get to say something like that and then tell me to sit down. Melissa. Daniel. I almost admired her commitment to making his name sound like an accusation. I went to the refrigerator and took out 3 bottles of water. After what had happened at the reunion, nobody seemed interested in anything poured into a glass. Daniel waited until Melissa finally sat. I've seen Scott's photograph before, he said. We're in connection with an investigation. Her face tightened. What kind of investigation? I can't discuss that. She gave a short, humorless laugh. Of course you can't. I'm not trying to be difficult. You never are. That's what makes it so impressive. Daniel ignored that. The name attached to the photograph wasn't Scott Mercer. What was it? I'm not going to give you another name until I know exactly what we're dealing with. Melissa looked at me as if I might translate him into ordinary English. I couldn't. So, what? She said, you saw a picture of somebody who looks like Scott. Yes, and from that, you decided he's a criminal. No, you grabbed a drink out of Claire's hand, because I didn't know why he was approaching my wife. Maybe because she was standing next to the drinks, I said. In fairness, I do have that effect on people. Neither of them laughed. Tough room. Daniel leaned forward. The investigation involved people using personal relationships to get access to financial information. Older victims. People with assets. Melissa's expression changed, but only slightly. Daniel continued. I'm not saying Scott committed a crime. I'm saying I recognized him in a context where I had no reason to expect him at my brother's house. Melissa looked toward the window. You've never liked him. That's not true. You asked me what he did for a living the first time I mentioned him. That's a fairly normal question. You asked where he went to college. You told me he went to Georgetown, so he said Syracuse at Christmas. I looked at Daniel. You remembered that? He shrugged. Melissa rolled her eyes. This is exactly what I mean. What? You're always doing this? Everybody's a discrepancy to you. Daniel sat back for a second. I could see the younger brother and sister, underneath the adults, sitting in my kitchen. Melissa had been divorced for 6 years. Her marriage had ended badly, but not dramatically. No secret second family, no private island. Her husband simply decided at 41 that he was happier somewhere else. And apparently that somewhere else included a 34-year-old dental hygienist named Kendra. Melissa had spent years afterward hearing variations of, you'll meet somebody from relatives who meant well and should have stopped. Then she met Scott. He remembered birthdays. He cooked. He called Evelyn just to check on her. More importantly, he treated Melissa like her decisions didn't require family approval. She looked at her brother now. Do you have actual evidence that Scott has done something? Daniel was quiet. Do you not enough for me to tell you that? Then maybe you should stop treating him like he's already guilty. The irritating part was that she wasn't entirely wrong. I trusted Daniel's instincts. I'd seen enough over 19 years to know that when something bothered him professionally, there was usually a reason. But I also knew what it was like to live with someone who always had 3 more pieces of information than everybody else. Sometimes being right didn't make him easier to live with. Daniel's phone rang. He looked at the screen. "Rick?" He answered and put it on speaker. "Yeah, what the hell happened?" Rick asked. "No, hello, no. Is Claire okay?" "Just that," Daniel said. "I'm sorting it out. How serious is this? I don't know yet." There were those words again. Rick exhaled. "You're not turning Mom's reunion into some federal circus, are you?" Daniel's eyebrows went up. I left quietly. "Well, people noticed. I'm sure they survived. Look, I don't know what you think you saw, but Scott's been good to Melissa." Melissa pointed at the phone as if Rick had just won her case. "Thank you," Rick continued. "The guy's decent. Don't make him into John Dillinger because he handed Claire a sangria." I glanced at Daniel. Something in his expression had sharpened. Not dramatically. "If you didn't know him, you'd miss it. I knew him." "How do you know what he handed?" "Claire?" Daniel asked. Silence, then Rick said, "Melissa told me." Melissa shook her head. I looked at her. She mouthed, "I didn't." Rick cleared his throat, or somebody did, I don't know. "Everybody's talking." Daniel let it go. "All right? I'll call you later. Just don't blow up the family over nothing." The call ended. Melissa immediately said, "See." Daniel looked at the dark phone screen. "See what even Rick thinks you're overreacting." Before Daniel could answer, Melissa's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then stopped. I knew immediately who it was. Scott. Daniel held out his hand. "Let me see." "No, Melissa. It's my phone. What did he say?" She read the message again. Her mouth tightened. Finally, she put the phone on the table and turned it around. The message read, "Your brother thinks I'm somebody else. Ask him about your mother's lake property." Nobody's for a moment. I read it twice. "What does your mother's property have to do with Scott?" Melissa picked up her phone. "Nothing." Daniel said that wasn't its answer. "I told Scott Mom sold the place." "So what?" Evelyn had inherited a small waterfront property from an aunt years earlier. She rented it out for a while, got tired of dealing with repairs and tenants, and finally sold it the previous fall. It wasn't a secret, but it wasn't exactly cocktail party material either. "How much did you tell him?" Daniel asked. "Nothing important." "Did you tell him what she got for it? Know where she put the money?" "No." "Did he ever talk to Mom about it?" Melissa looked away. There it was. I said Melissa. He gave her a name. Daniel went still. "What name?" "A financial advisor." "When?" "I don't know." "January, February. Scott introduced Mom to somebody handling her money. He didn't handle anything. He recommended somebody." "How do you know?" "Because that's what Mom told me." Daniel stood and walked away from the table. Melissa immediately became defensive again. "Stop doing that." "Doing what?" "Acting like I handed Mom's social security number to a guy in a parking lot." "I didn't say you did. You don't have to." I watched the two of them and suddenly understood something unpleasant. Daniel kept things from people because he thought information was dangerous. Melissa kept things from Daniel because she thought judgment was inevitable. Evelyn apparently kept things from both of them because she didn't want her children managing her life. And somewhere in the middle of all that silence was a man named Scott Mercer, or maybe not Scott Mercer, who seemed to know exactly which doors were open. Daniel picked up his phone. "Who are you calling?" I asked. "Mom." He put it on speaker. Evelyn answered on the 4th ring. "If this is about you leaving without saying goodbye, I'm still deciding how offended I am." "Mom, I need to ask you something. That sentence has never improved my day." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "Did you invest any of the money from the lake property through someone Scott recommended?" There was no answer. "Mom, I heard you." "Did you?" Another pause. Then Evelyn said very clearly, "Daniel, I am 74 years old. I don't need your permission to invest my own money." I looked at my husband. He looked at me. Neither of us needed her to say yes. She already had. By 9 the next morning, we were sitting around Evelyn's kitchen table like the world's least cheerful breakfast club. Evelyn had made coffee. Nobody was drinking much of it. Daniel sat across from his mother, with the yellow legal pad in front of him. Melissa was beside me, arms folded. Rick had shown up 10 minutes late, carrying a cardboard tray from Duncan, apparently under the impression that 6 donuts could restore order to the Bennett family. They could not, Daniel started. Mom, when did you first meet the advisor? Scott recommended. Evelyn stared at him. Are you taking notes? I want to keep the timeline straight. You're taking notes, Mom. Daniel, stop talking to me like I'm somebody you interviewed downtown. I'm trying to help, then be my son for 5 minutes. Daniel, put the pen down. That was when I stepped in. Evelyn, forget Daniel's questions. He looked at me. I ignored him. Just tell us what happened. Start wherever it makes sense to you. Evelyn gave her son a pointed look. See, Claire knows how conversation works. Daniel leaned back. I had been married long enough to know when to enjoy a victory quietly. Evelyn told us that Scott had mentioned a financial advisor named Kevin Wallace sometime in January. She had complained about the interest she was earning on the proceeds from the lake property, and Scott said he knew someone who worked with retirees and conservative investments. I am not a retiree, Evelyn said. Rick blinked. Mom, you retired 11 years ago. That's an employment status, Richard, not a personality. Despite everything, I smiled. She had spoken with Wallace twice by phone, then met him at an office in Columbia. The office existed. There was a receptionist, business cards, framed licenses on the wall. Nothing about it had looked suspicious to her. How much? Daniel asked. Evelyn looked at him. How much? What? How much did you invest? She hesitated. That was the first time all morning she looked less than completely sure of herself. $180,000. Melissa sat up. You put $180,000 into something Scott recommended. Evelyn's eyes flashed. Please don't join your brother. I'm not joining anybody. I didn't know it was that much. It's my money. I know. Then stop saying the number like I bought a racehorse. Across the table, Rick reached for his coffee and nearly knocked it over. He caught it before it tipped. Do you have all the paperwork? He asked. The question itself was reasonable. It was how quickly he asked it that caught my attention. Evelyn nodded. Of course I have the paperwork. Statements too. Yes, Richard. Daniel glanced at Rick, but only briefly. Evelyn got up and went toward the den. While we waited, Melissa turned on Daniel. You knew about this kind of thing and never told us. I didn't know Scott was anywhere near this family. I mean the investigation. I couldn't discuss it. Of course. Daniel's jaw tightened. I could feel another round starting. Then something came back to me. Not from the night before, from the reunion. Scott had been standing beside Evelyn near the kitchen door, teasing her because she'd complained about what the lake property sold for after taxes. He'd said something like, Tommy would tell you to spend some of it on yourself. At the time, I'd barely noticed. Now I did. When Evelyn came back carrying a thick accordion folder, I asked, How did Scott know you called Dad Tommy? She stopped. Daniel turned toward me. Melissa frowned. What, yesterday? Scott called your father Tommy. Rick said, So nobody calls him Tommy. Their father's name had been Thomas. Daniel and his siblings called him Dad. Grandchildren called him Grandpa. Everybody else had called him Tom. Only Evelyn called him Tommy, usually when she was telling a story about when they were young. Evelyn set the folder on the table. He may have heard me say it. When I asked, she didn't answer immediately. Melissa leaned forward. Mom. Evelyn pulled out a chair. He stopped by a few times. Melissa stared at her. Scott. Yes. Here, yes. Without me, Evelyn gave her a look. You don't supervise my visitors either. That's not what I'm asking. He was helping me organize some things. Daniel reached for the folder. Evelyn slapped her hand down on top of it. I'm giving you these because Claire asked me like an adult. Do not make me regret it. Daniel slowly withdrew his hand. Yes, ma'am. She slid the folder toward him. For the next 15 minutes, we went through statements and letters. I understood maybe 70% of it, which was still more than I expected before breakfast. The statements looked legitimate. Evelyn's account showed modest gains. Company logos, account numbers, quarterly summaries. Then Daniel stopped at one document. What is this? Evelyn leaned over. Something about letting Melissa help if I ever needed it. Melissa looked confused. Help with what finances? You never asked me. I hadn't decided. Daniel placed the pages flat on the table. At the top it said, Durable Financial Power of Attorney. I knew what that meant in broad terms. Evelyn would be giving someone authority to handle financial matters for her, under specified circumstances. Melissa's name appeared as the proposed agent. That's weird, she said. Daniel turned another page. There was a signature near the bottom. Melissa leaned closer. Her expression changed. "That's supposed to be mine, is it?" Daniel asked. "No," Rick said. "Maybe it's just a draft." Melissa picked up the page. "A draft with my signature." Evelyn looked genuinely shaken now, not confused, angry. "I never gave anybody permission to sign Melissa's name." Daniel's voice became very calm. "Mom, did you sign this?" "No." "Did you authorize anyone to prepare it?" "I discussed the possibility. That's all." Rick leaned over. "Maybe somebody at the office copied the wrong form." Daniel turned his head. "What office?" Rick paused. "The advisor's office." "How do you know where this came from?" Rick's eyes moved toward the paperwork. "I don't. I'm saying maybe that's where it came from." "You said the office like you knew." "Oh, for God's sake, Daniel. Scott showed me their website once. That's all." The room went quiet. Daniel didn't push. That interested me almost as much as Rick's answer. A year earlier, I probably wouldn't have noticed any of it. But now, I was noticing everything. Not because I had suddenly become an investigator. I hadn't. I was simply paying attention to what people said when they were uncomfortable. And everybody at that table was uncomfortable, for a different reason. Daniel eventually explained that someone else would need to handle the investigative side, now that his own family was directly involved. Evelyn frowned. "So you're staying out of it as much as I'm required to." I couldn't resist. "So, for once, somebody else gets to tell you to stay out of something." Daniel looked at me. Melissa snorted. Even Evelyn smiled. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, but we needed those 3 seconds. Then Melissa stood. "I need some air." She picked up her purse. "Where are you going?" Daniel asked. "See, this is why nobody tells you anything." She walked out. I almost followed her, but Evelyn started asking questions about whether her accounts were safe. Daniel finally had something useful to do, so we stayed. By late afternoon, we were home. I was putting laundry into the washer when my phone buzzed. "Melissa, I'm meeting Scott." "Don't tell Daniel. I need to hear him explain it himself." I read it twice. There are moments in a family when loyalty means keeping somebody's confidence. And there are moments when keeping their confidence would be idiotic. I gave myself about 3 seconds to decide which one this was. Then I walked into the living room. Daniel was on the couch reading something on his laptop. I stopped in front of him. "You're going to hate your sister." He looked up. "What did she do?" I handed him my phone. Daniel read Melissa's text once. Then again, for a man trained to stay calm, he had a remarkably expressive way of closing a laptop. "Where is she meeting him?" She didn't say. He called her straight to voicemail. He tried again. Same result. "Don't start pacing," I said. "I'm not pacing. You're standing up with nowhere to go. That's pacing with better posture." He ignored me and sent her a text. 30 seconds later, my phone rang. "Melissa," I answered. "Before you yell at me, I'm not going to yell." "You told Daniel." "Yes. I specifically asked you not to, and I specifically ignored you." "Claire, you can be mad at me tomorrow. Tonight, I'd rather have you alive enough to do it." There was a pause, then she sighed. "I'm meeting him at Harbor House." I knew the place. Busy waterfront restaurant, plenty of people around. That made me feel slightly better. Daniel held out his hand for my phone. I shook my head. "Are you already there?" I asked. "Parking. Stay in public. Don't go anywhere else with him." "I'm not an idiot." "I didn't say you were behind me." Daniel mouthed. "Put me on." I turned away from him. "Your brother needs to know where you are. He knows now." "That isn't what I said." Another pause. "Fine, tell him. But I'm talking to Scott." She hung up. Daniel was already making a call. Not to Melissa, to the agents who were handling the matter now. And then, because apparently neither of us had enough sense to stay home, we drove her to Annapolis. We didn't go inside the restaurant. Daniel had been very clear that the last thing anyone needed was him walking up to Scott and turning Melissa's conversation into a confrontation. So, we sat in a parking lot nearby, like the least romantic stakeout in Maryland. I looked at the dashboard clock. "How long?" 11 minutes. "It feels like 40. It's been 11. This is why nobody enjoys waiting with you." He glanced at me. "Claire, I know." I stopped talking. Later, Melissa told me exactly what happened inside. Scott was already seated when she arrived. He stood when he saw her. That detail bothered her afterward, not because it was suspicious, because it was familiar. Scott always stood when she approached a table. He pulled out chairs, remembered how she took her coffee. called when he said he would. Manipulative people would be much easier to recognize if they were unpleasant all the time. What's going on? He asked. You tell me. He looked tired rather than nervous. That was clever too. Your brother thinks I'm somebody I'm not. He says he's seen you before. I'm sure he thinks he has. What about the paperwork? Scott shook his head. Melissa, I don't prepare legal documents. My signature is on one, then somebody made a mistake. A mistake? A draft gets populated from the wrong file. Somebody scans the wrong page. Offices screw things up. It was plausible enough to make her hesitate. Scott saw that. Then he went after the part of Melissa that had been bruised for years. Your brother has spent your whole life deciding who you should trust. She told me later that was the moment she almost got up and left. Not because he was wrong, but because he was too right. Scott continued. You finally make one decision without asking Daniel's permission. And what happens? He turns it into an investigation. This isn't about Daniel, isn't it? No. Then why are we talking about what your brother thinks instead of what you know about me? Melissa didn't have a good answer. That was Scott's talent. He could take a legitimate question and make you feel guilty for asking it. She asked why he had been visiting Evelyn without telling her. Your mother asked for help. She's my mother. She's also an adult. Again, partly true. She didn't want Daniel involved in every financial decision she made. Scott said, Can you really blame her? Melissa couldn't. That was the problem. Then she asked about the investment. Scott leaned back. Your mother made a conservative investment through a legitimate business. She wasn't risking her whole future over $180,000. Melissa went still. Scott kept talking. Maybe another 5 seconds. Then he saw her face. What? How much did you say? He paused. The investment. How much? I thought you told me. No, your mother must have. She says she didn't. Scott reached for his water. Then maybe Wallace mentioned it. Why would her financial advisor tell you how much she invested? He didn't have an answer ready. For the first time, Melissa saw him searching for one. She stood. Sit down. Let me explain. She picked up her purse. That sounded less like a boyfriend. Then she walked out. 20 minutes after Daniel and I arrived, I saw her crossing the parking lot toward us. She got into the back seat. Daniel turned around. Are you okay? Please don't. 2 words. He faced forward again. I drove this time. We made it halfway home before Melissa started crying quietly. No dramatic sobbing. She just sat behind me, wiping at her cheeks and getting angrier every time another tear appeared. I wanted him to have an explanation, she said. I looked at her in the mirror. I know. No, you don't. Maybe not exactly. She stared out the window. I said, but I know what it's like to want someone you love to tell you the version you can live with. Daniel looked at me. I kept my eyes on the road. That sentence wasn't only about Melissa. He knew it. A few days later, we got the answer about my drink. Nothing. No drug, no poison, nothing dangerous. Just sangria. When Daniel told me, I said, So, you stole a perfectly good drink. It wasn't that good. You didn't even taste it. I smelled it. Of course you did. For about 10 seconds, the whole thing was funny. Then I asked the question that had been bothering me. Why give it to me? Daniel sat across from me at the kitchen table. To talk to you. He could have just talked to me. Handing somebody a drink gives you a reason to walk over. Then the conversation feels natural. I thought about Scott's questions. My job, Emily. Daniel's travel when I got home. So, he was gathering information. Possibly. Why me? Daniel hesitated. That hesitation was getting on my nerves. Say it. He may have thought you were the least suspicious person there. I stared at him. The harmless wife. I didn't say that. You took too long not saying it, Claire. No, listen. He did. You were right about Scott. Daniel opened his mouth. I held up my hand. That doesn't mean you were right about everything else. He closed it. I'm not asking you to tell me about investigations. I'm not asking for names or files or whatever else you legally can't discuss. I know, but if something affects me or Emily, you don't get to decide that ignorance is safer for us. His expression softened. Protecting me cannot mean keeping me ignorant. Daniel looked down at the table. Then he nodded. You're right. No defense, no qualification, just that it mattered more than I expected. 2 days later, he came home while I was making dinner and set his phone beside the cutting board. The team found where some of the information came from. I stopped chopping onions. Scott. Before Scott got close to Melissa, I put down the knife. Then Melissa didn't give it to him. No. Evelyn. Daniel shook his head. I already knew I wasn't going to like the answer. Who? He looked at me. Rick. And suddenly I saw 3 moments all over again. Rick talking to Scott beside the house. Rick defending him on the phone. Rick asking about the office before anyone had told him which office the paperwork came from. They hadn't meant much separately together. They meant something entirely different. Rick didn't deny talking to Scott. That would have been easier. Instead, he sat in his own living room the following Sunday, rubbed both hands over his face, and said, "It wasn't what you think." I looked at Melissa. She looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Rick. Evelyn said, "That sentence has never once been followed by good news." Nobody argued with her. We had agreed to meet at Rick's house, because Daniel's colleagues had already spoken with him. Daniel had been very careful about that. He wasn't investigating his brother. He wasn't showing us evidence or pretending this was some family-run federal inquiry. What we were dealing with that afternoon was the part no agency could settle for us. Why Rick had kept quiet. His wife, Linda, was upstairs. She knew enough by then to understand that Rick had been hiding more than one thing. Rick stared at the floor. "My company's been having problems." Daniel said nothing. "How bad?" Evelyn asked. "Bad. That's not a number. Mom, you all seem very fond of vague answers lately." Rick sighed. 2 major commercial customers had paid months late. Material costs had gone up. He had lines of credit, equipment loans, payroll insurance. At first, he'd thought he could work his way through it. Then he borrowed more. Then he stopped telling Linda how bad things were. Melissa asked, "What does any of that have to do with Scott?" Rick looked at her. He knew people who arranged private financing. "You asked my boyfriend for money?" "No. I asked about lenders when last year." Melissa stared at him. That was before she and Scott had become serious. Daniel finally spoke. "What information did you give him?" Rick's head came up. "I already went through this with the agents," Daniel said. "I'm asking you as your brother." I watched Daniel carefully. There was a difference in his voice. Not much of one, but enough. Rick heard it too. "Company assets, property, some family background." "What family background?" "I don't remember every conversation." Melissa gave a bitter laugh. "I bet you remember now." Rick looked irritated. "I wasn't giving him Mom's bank account." "No," she said, "just telling him she had money. I didn't know what he was doing." That became Rick's shield. He said it again when Daniel asked about the lake property. Again, when Evelyn asked whether he'd told Scott she lived alone. Again, when Melissa asked why Scott knew so much about their family before she'd ever introduced him to everyone. I didn't know. Finally, I asked, "When did you start wondering?" Rick looked at me. "What? You keep telling us you didn't know what he was doing." "Fine, I believe you didn't know at first." He shifted in his chair. "When did you start wondering?" Nobody moved. Rick glanced at Daniel. I said, "Don't look at him, I'm asking." His mouth tightened. "I thought Scott was getting too interested in Mom's finances." "When?" "A few months ago." Melissa sat back. "A few months. I didn't know it was criminal. But something bothered you." "Yes, and you didn't say anything." Rick stood. "What was I supposed to say?" "Hey everybody, the guy helping me find financing is asking questions I don't like. And by the way, my business is buried in debt." Evelyn answered before anyone else could. "Yes." Rick turned toward her. "Mom, Richard, that is exactly what you were supposed to say." His face wrinkled. "You don't understand." "I understand being embarrassed. This is more than embarrassment. I understand that too." "You would have told Daniel probably. And then he would have started digging through my life." Daniel said, "You mean I might have found out you were in trouble?" Rick rounded on him there. "That you always have to know everything." Daniel started to answer, then stopped because inconveniently, Rick had touched the same nerve Melissa had. It didn't excuse anything, but it wasn't entirely false. Melissa leaned forward. "You knew enough to be worried about Scott." Rick looked at her. "You knew enough to keep an eye on him. But when Daniel started questioning me, you said nothing." "I didn't know what Daniel knew." "You defended Scott." "I was trying to keep everybody calm." "No. You were trying to keep yourself out of it." Rick looked away. Melissa's voice dropped. "You watched my own brother look at me like I'd opened the front door for a criminal." "Melissa, and you let me think this was my fault." "I didn't know." "You knew enough." That ended the argument. Not because Rick agreed, because there wasn't much left to say. Evelyn had been quiet for nearly a minute. Then she asked, "Did you know Scott was visiting me?" Rick didn't answer quickly enough. Her face changed. "Richard, I knew he'd stopped by once or twice." "You knew." "I didn't know why. You could have asked me." "I should have. You could have told me your business was struggling." "I had it handled." Evelyn looked around the room. At the risk of stating the obvious, you did not. Even Melissa almost smiled. Almost. Rick sat again. Evelyn studied him. "I wouldn't have cared that you were having money trouble. Mom, I would have cared. I wouldn't have been ashamed of you." Rick looked down. "But you watched someone get closer to me while you were worried about him, because telling the truth might make you look foolish." Her voice never rose. That made it worse. "I can forgive losing money," she said. "I don't know yet what I'm going to do with that." Daniel started asking Rick about when Scott had first mentioned Evelyn. The tone changed immediately. Dates, conversations, locations. Agent Bennett had returned. I touched Daniel's arm. He looked at me. "Your colleagues can investigate him." "I'm just asking, I know." Rick watched us. I lowered my voice. "Your mother needs her sons right now, not Special Agent Bennett." For a second, Daniel looked annoyed. Then he glanced at Evelyn. He sat back. Okay, that was new. The consequences came slowly after that, which is usually how consequences come in real life. Scott was arrested weeks later as part of the broader fraud investigation. Daniel wasn't the man putting handcuffs on him, and there was no dramatic family audience watching it happen. I was glad. By then, I didn't need theater. Evelyn eventually recovered a substantial portion of her money after funds connected to the operation were frozen. Not all of it. That hurt. Rick wasn't charged as a knowing participant in the fraud, but his secrets didn't disappear because the government didn't prosecute him. Linda learned about the debts. They started counseling. Rick sold 2 pieces of equipment and cut his business down to something he could actually afford to operate. Melissa stopped asking for updates about Scott, at least from me. Then several weeks after the reunion, Evelyn called. "Come over. Is everything okay?" "Yes." "What happened, Claire?" "If I explained it on the phone, there would be no reason for you to come over." Fair point. When I arrived, she had photographs spread across her kitchen table. Her cousin Diane had taken them at the reunion. Evelyn pushed one toward me. "Look." I saw myself near the drink table. Scott was handing me the glass. "What am I looking for?" "Not you." I looked again. Scott's face was turned slightly away from me. He was looking across the patio at Daniel. In another photograph taken seconds later, Daniel was closer. Scott was already moving away. I stared at the 2 pictures side by side. Suddenly, the sequence made sense. The questions, the drink, Scott disappearing the moment Daniel approached. That evening, I showed Daniel the photographs. He studied them for a long time. "He recognized me," he said. I nodded. "He was testing you." Daniel looked at the first picture again. "Probably using me." His eyes came up. Months earlier, he might have softened the wording. Told me we couldn't know for sure. Given me something technically accurate and emotionally useless. This time he didn't. "Yes," he said. And strangely enough, hearing the truth that plainly bothered me, less than being protected from it ever had. Scott's arrest didn't fix the Bennett family. I think that surprised Daniel more than it surprised me. He'd spent most of his adult life working in a world where problems eventually became cases. Cases became evidence. Evidence became charges, or it didn't. There were procedures, deadlines, people whose job it was to decide what happened next. Families don't come with any of that. 3 months later, Scott was still moving through the federal court system, and I had stopped asking Daniel for updates. Most of what he could tell me was public anyway. Evelyn got a substantial portion of her money back, but not all of it. She hated that. Not because the loss threatened her house or retirement. It didn't. She hated knowing somebody had studied her closely enough to figure out what would work. Her answer was very Evelyn. She hired an independent fiduciary advisor, not Daniel. When she told him we were sitting in our kitchen. "You interviewed him?" Daniel asked her. Evelyn corrected. "You checked her credentials?" "Yes." "References?" "Yes." "Background?" Evelyn looked at me. "Does he do this in his sleep?" "Sometimes he questions the toaster." Daniel ignored us. "I'm serious, Mom." "So am I." I chose her because she's qualified and she has no emotional investment in controlling my life. Daniel looked offended. I don't want to control your life. Evelyn and I both stared at him. He sighed. Fine. I heard it. Later, after she left, he said, I still think I should have access. That's called independence, Daniel. Your mother was right about one thing. One, don't ruin the moment. He smiled despite himself. Melissa had a harder time. She started seeing a therapist. Though she told us almost nothing about it, which I thought was probably healthy, considering her family's tendency to treat personal information like a group project. For a while, she was embarrassed that she'd believed Scott. One afternoon, she came over for coffee and said, I keep replaying everything he said. Don't. Very useful advice. I have more. Don't date criminals. She gave me a look. Anything else, Floss? That finally got a laugh out of her. Then she became serious. How did I not see it? I knew what she wanted me to say. That Scott had been brilliant, that anyone would have fallen for him, that none of it had anything to do with choices she made. But Melissa didn't need another person protecting her from uncomfortable truths. You wanted him to be real, I said. She looked down at her coffee. That's pathetic. No, it feels pathetic. Believing somebody loves you isn't stupidity. She looked at me. Refusing to look after you no better is where the trouble starts. Melissa narrowed her eyes. You rehearsed that since Tuesday. She laughed again. Rick's life changed, too. Linda stayed. That didn't mean she forgave him overnight. They went to counseling. Rick sold 2 pieces of equipment and reduced the size of his contracting business. He also told his adult sons how much debt he'd hidden. According to Evelyn, that conversation was biblical. I didn't ask for details. Melissa still wasn't ready to forgive him. Neither was Evelyn. That was another thing our family had to learn. Reconciliation and forgiveness aren't synonyms. You can sit at the same table before everything is settled. Sometimes sitting at the table is simply where you start. Daniel and I had our own work to do. He still couldn't tell me everything about his job. I stopped wanting him to. What I wanted was much simpler. One evening, he came home late, loosened his tie, and found me sorting mail. There's something going on at work that may affect my schedule this week, he said. I waited. It isn't a danger to you or Emily. I can't give you more than that yet. I looked up. What? He frowned. What? You just told me something? Yes, without making me drag it out of you. He rolled his eyes. I'm capable of personal growth. Should I call somebody? Don't make me regret it. It was such a small thing. A year earlier, he would have said work thing. Might be late. Same confidentiality. Completely different marriage. A few weeks after that, Evelyn invited us to Sunday lunch. Only immediate family this time. No 30-person reunion. No name tags. No matching shirts that made grown adults look like employees at a garden center. Rick came early and helped set the table. Melissa brought an apple pie. Emily arrived with wine. Daniel took the bottle from her and studied the label. I said, please tell me the Bureau has finally cracked the Cabernet problem. He turned the bottle around. Can't discuss an active investigation. It has a screw cap, Emily said. Criminals are getting sophisticated. Even Evelyn laughed. Nobody mentioned Scott during lunch. We didn't need to. He'd occupied enough space in that family. When Daniel and I were getting ready to leave, Evelyn touched my arm. Stay a minute. Daniel looked at me. I'll be outside. That alone was progress. Evelyn waited until everyone else had gone. Then she began rearranging forks that were already perfectly arranged. I owe you an apology. That was not a sentence Evelyn used casually. For what? For a lot of years. Actually, I stayed quiet. She looked at me. I thought of you as Daniel's wife. I am Daniel's wife. You know what I mean? I did. The Bennett had never been cruel to me. That almost made it harder to explain. I was included, invited, welcomed, but there was always an invisible distinction between the Bennett and the people who married them. Daniel handled serious things. Rick handled practical things. Melissa handled emotions whether she wanted to or not, and I brought potato salad. Evelyn said, when everything happened, you were the only one in the room who wasn't trying to prove something. I had my moments. Yes, well, you hid them better. I smiled. She reached for my hand. I was wrong about that. No tears, no grand speech, just Evelyn telling the truth. I squeezed her fingers, then don't treat me like a guest anymore. She nodded. Fair enough. On the drive home, I thought about that first afternoon. Scott walking toward me with 2 glasses. Daniel taking mine. You didn't see who handed you that? For weeks, I thought the whole story was about something I had failed to notice. It wasn't. All of us had missed something. Evelyn hadn't noticed when independence started turning into secrecy. Melissa hadn't noticed how badly she needed Scott to be exactly who he claimed to be. Rick did notice warning signs. His mistake was deciding not to look any closer. Daniel hadn't noticed that sometimes his version of protection felt exactly like exclusion to the people he loved. And me, I'd spent 19 years getting comfortable being the harmless wife, the one who didn't need all the details, the one who kept everybody calm, the one who brought the potato salad. I still bring it, by the way. I make excellent potato salad. I just ask more questions now. And no, I don't inspect every glass somebody hands me. Daniel does enough of that for both of us. But I pay a lot more attention to the people around the table. Because Scott didn't get into our family by being smarter than everybody. He got in because each of us had something we preferred not to look at. Sometimes the thing that protects you isn't knowing everything. It's being willing to notice what you'd rather ignore. If this story stayed with you, thank you for listening. Take good care of yourself and pay attention to who's around you. 3 days after my wedding, my new stepson arrived at my front door with a lawyer and papers that would put my house under my husband's control. It was 9:12 on a Tuesday morning. I remember the time because I'd just looked at the microwave clock and wondered whether 9 in the morning was too early to eat the last piece of wedding cake. At 57, I've decided there are fewer rules about cake than people pretend. Richard had left around 7:30 for a client meeting in Columbus. I was still in my robe drinking coffee and sorting through wedding cards at the kitchen counter when the camera doorbell chimed. I glanced at my phone. Evan, my new husband's 34-year-old son, was standing on my porch in a navy quarter zip, looking considerably more dressed for business than I was. Beside him stood a man I'd never seen before. Gray suit, leather briefcase. I opened the door halfway. Morning. Hey Maggie, Evan smiled, sorry to drop by. The man beside him extended his hand. Graham Pike. I shook it. Then he added, I'm an attorney now. There are sentences that improve a Tuesday morning. I brought donuts. Your property taxes have been abolished. George Clooney is lost and needs directions. I'm an attorney is rarely one of them. I looked at Evan. Should I put on shoes? He laughed like I was joking. I wasn't entirely. It's nothing bad, he said. Dad wanted us to get some paperwork handled. Dad has my phone number. He's tied up with a client. Graham looked slightly uncomfortable already, which I found interesting. I let them in. We sat at the dining room table, where 3 nights earlier, Richard and I had opened champagne after coming home from our wedding reception. There were still 2 unopened cards on the sideboard. Graham placed a folder in front of me. I understand Richard discussed some estate planning changes with you. No. He stopped. Evan jumped in. Not specifically, maybe. That's generally what discussed means. Maggie, it's routine, that word routine. I opened the folder. The first page had a name printed across the top. Bennett Family Holdings, LLC. I read enough legal documents during 32 years of marriage to Thomas to know one thing: if somebody is waiting for your signature, don't start with the signature page. I turned back to page 1. Graham explained that the proposal involved transferring title to my house into the LLC. He used phrases like asset protection, estate efficiency, and simplifying things for the family. I let him finish. Then I asked who owns Bennett Family Holdings. Evan answered too quickly. It's Dad's company, Graham corrected him. Richard is the managing member. Evan also holds an interest. I looked from one to the other. What interest do I hold? Neither answered immediately. That answered it. So, let me make sure I've got this right. The family company has my husband in it. Yes, Graham said. And his son? Yes, and not me. Graham adjusted the papers. The ownership structure can certainly be revisited. I looked at Evan. And we're putting my house in it. He sighed. It's just paperwork, Maggie. I've noticed people usually say that when it's paperwork, they want somebody else to sign. Graham almost smiled. Evan didn't. For context, the house wasn't some mansion behind iron gates. It was a comfortable brick home in Dublin, Ohio. 4 bedrooms, a small backyard kitchen remodeled 8 years earlier because Thomas had once opened a cabinet, and the door came off in his hand. We'd bought it together, raised our daughter there. Thomas died there. The mortgage had been paid off years ago. I wasn't sentimental about every chair or lampshade in the place, but the deed was mine. And 3 days into my new marriage, 2 men were sitting at my table explaining why that should change. I picked up my phone. "I'm calling Richard." Evan leaned back. "Dad's in a meeting. Then he'll call me afterward." I called. Voicemail. I waited 30 seconds and called again. Voicemail. Evan checked his watch. I noticed because he did it again, maybe 2 minutes later. "Use somewhere you need to be." "No, because your wrist seems worried." He gave me an irritated look. "Maggie, Dad said you'd probably get emotional about the house." That one got me. I didn't say anything for a moment. Not because Evan had insulted me. I'd been called worse things by better people. It was because Richard had apparently anticipated this conversation. He'd talked about my reaction with his son, maybe even planned around it. I looked at Graham. If I sign this, what authority does Richard have over property owned by this LLC? Graham chose his words carefully. As manager, he would have fairly broad authority under the operating agreement, including borrowing. He paused. "Potentially, yes." Evan cut in. "That's not what this is about," I asked the lawyer. Graham nodded once. "The agreement does contemplate financing transactions." I closed the folder. "I'm not signing anything." Evan stared at me. "Seriously, very. You haven't even read all of it." "Then I'm definitely not signing it." Graham spoke before Evan could. "Mrs. Bennett is absolutely entitled to have independent counsel review these documents." "Mrs. Bennett?" That was still new enough that I almost looked around for somebody else. Evan pushed his chair back. "Dad's trying to protect the family." I met his eyes. I thought I was the family. He didn't have much to say after that. Graham gathered his briefcase. I kept the copies. At the door, Evan said, "You're making this into something it isn't. Then Richard shouldn't have any trouble explaining what it is." They left at 9:47. I locked the door and stood there for a few seconds. Then I called Laura Chen. Laura had handled estate matters for Thomas and me for years. She'd also coordinated with the attorney who represented me when Richard and I negotiated our prenup. She answered on the 4th ring. "Maggie, aren't you supposed to be newly married and ignoring everybody?" That was the plan. "What happened?" "My stepson just brought me a lawyer." There was a pause. "That seems early." Despite myself, I laughed. "I have some documents I need you to look at. Send them." I made coffee and sat back down. I wasn't trying to play detective. I didn't suddenly believe Richard was some criminal mastermind. I wanted there to be a boring explanation. In fact, I was counting on one. While scanning the operating agreement again, I found the section Graham had mentioned. The manager could negotiate financing involving company property. That didn't mean Richard planned to borrow against my house, but it meant I would have been a fool not to ask. Then I went back to the LLC paperwork, registered agent, business address, manager, formation date. I read the date once, then again, 11 days before our wedding. I sat back. That bothered me more than anything Evan had said. 11 days before our wedding, I had been arguing with the florist about whether we really needed extra greenery on tables. Nobody would remember. Richard had been creating Bennett Family Holdings. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. I wanted one badly enough that I'm embarrassed to admit how quickly I started inventing possibilities for him. Maybe his accountant recommended it. Maybe it involved some unrelated property. Maybe Evan was the one pushing everything. Then I looked at the wedding cards on the counter. One was still standing open to Maggie and Richard. "May this be the beginning of your happiest chapter." I reached over and turned it face down, because by then I wasn't really wondering why my husband wanted my house in an LLC. I was wondering why he decided he needed that LLC before I ever became his wife. I didn't tell Richard I'd called Laura. That may sound calculating. It wasn't. At least it didn't feel that way at the time. I simply wanted one conversation where I wasn't reacting to information somebody else had already had time to prepare. After Evan left, I spent most of the afternoon doing ordinary things badly. I ran the dishwasher half full, started laundry and forgot about it, went to the grocery store for milk, and came home with coffee filters, bananas, and no milk. My mind kept circling back to the same question. Why before the wedding? And once that question got into my head, Older conversations started coming back, not dramatic ones. That's the trouble with hindsight. Nobody plays ominous music when somebody asks whether your mortgage is paid off. About 6 months earlier, Richard and I had been sitting on the back patio when he'd asked, "You and Tom bought this place when 98. Still have a mortgage?" I laughed. "At our age, God, I hope not." He'd smiled. Smart, that was it. Another time driving home from dinner, he'd asked whether Thomas had kept any commercial property after selling the company. "A couple of buildings," I'd said. "Still in the family, some are." Then he'd changed the subject to Ohio State football. Nothing about those conversations had bothered me. Richard knew I had money. That was never a secret between us. When we'd negotiated the prenup, both of us had separate attorneys. My financial schedules made it very clear that I had substantial assets from my marriage to Thomas. Richard had his retirement accounts, business interests, and property. I had mine. We weren't two 25-year-olds starting out with a sofa and $2,200. We were people in our 60s, or close enough in my case, with entire lives behind us. The exact current value of my investments wasn't something I discussed over meatloaf. Apparently, though, Richard had been paying attention to the shape of things. One memory bothered me more than the others. I'd been complaining about the estimate for replacing part of the roof. Richard had laughed and said, "You're lucky you don't have to worry about money like normal people." I'd laughed too. Sitting alone at my kitchen table now, I heard the sentence differently. Not like I do, like normal people. At 6:40 that evening, the garage door opened. Richard came in carrying a white paper bag from the little Italian restaurant I liked. "Peace offering," he called. That was an unfortunate choice of words. "For what?" He appeared in the kitchen doorway and kissed my cheek. Being gone all day 3 days after our wedding, he held up the bag. "Lasagna, garlic bread, that salad you like with too much cheese." I watched him unpack everything. He looked normal. Same blue shirt he'd left in that morning. Reading glasses sticking out of his breast pocket. Slight crease between his eyebrows from a day of staring at contracts. I almost wished he'd looked guilty. Instead, he looked like my husband. "How was your day?" I asked. "Long. Anything unusual happened?" "Not really." He took 2 plates from the cabinet. I waited. He didn't say another word. Finally, I said, "Your son brought a lawyer to my house." Richard stopped with the lasagna container halfway open. There it was, only for a second, Maggie. His name was Graham. I know Graham. I assumed so. He wasn't selling magazine subscriptions. Richard set the container down. "Evan wasn't supposed to come over without me talking to you first. That's interesting because Evan seemed to think you sent him." I told him we needed to get some things organized. He jumped ahead. "With your lawyer. He's worked with Graham before." I pulled out a chair. "Sit down." Richard stared at me. "Can we eat first?" "No," he sat. I put the LLC documents between us. "What is Bennett Family Holdings?" He rubbed his forehead. "It's exactly what Graham probably told you. An entity for consolidating some family assets, estate planning, liability protection. Why isn't my name on it?" "It could be, but it isn't, Maggie. You're getting hung up on a draft." "Why was the draft at my house with a place for my signature?" He leaned back. "Because eventually I thought we'd put the house into it." "You thought?" "Yes." "Did you think about asking me I was going to before or after I signed?" His mouth tightened. "That isn't fair." Neither of us spoke for a few seconds. Then Richard said, "Look, Evan handled this badly. I'll talk to him. This isn't about Evan. He's the one who showed up. You created the LLC. That stopped him." I slid the formation page across the table and tapped the date. 11 days before our wedding. Richard looked down for the first time. His irritation replaced the apologetic tone. So I wasn't your wife 11 days before our wedding. We knew we were getting married. Apparently you also knew where you wanted my house." He stood. "Come on, Maggie." "No, explain it. We're married now. At some point, there has to be an ours." "I agree." That seemed to surprise him. I said, "There absolutely should be an ours." His shoulders loosened. "But ours doesn't begin with your name on my deed." He looked away. I hated that we were having the conversation. That's probably the part people don't understand when they hear stories like this afterward. They imagine you feel powerful the moment you catch something wrong. I didn't. I felt tired. I wanted him to say one thing that would let me go back 3 hours and stop wondering. Eventually Richard sat down again. You're right. I waited. I should have talked to you first, yes. And I shouldn't have let Evan get involved. No. I'll take care of it. What does that mean? We won't move the house, just like that. He reached across the table, but I didn't take his hand. His face changed. Maggie, I'm sorry. And the awful thing was he sounded sorry. We ate dinner 20 minutes later. The lasagna was cold. Neither of us mentioned it. That night, Richard said he'd sleep in the guest room and give me some space. I told him he didn't have to. He said, I think I do. After he left the bedroom, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. There was a framed wedding photograph on the dresser. Richard was looking at me in it instead of the camera. I remembered the first year after Thomas died. People had worried about birthdays and anniversaries, but nobody warned me about Tuesdays. Tuesdays were worse. Nothing happened on Tuesdays. No one checked on you. You'd walk into the house with groceries and realize nobody cared whether you'd remembered the milk. Once, about 6 months after Thomas died, I'd come home from dinner with Denise and called into the hallway. Tom? You wouldn't believe what Denise. Then I'd stopped. The house had answered for him. Richard had changed that. He'd made ordinary days ordinary again. Coffee in the morning. Somebody complaining about the thermostat. Somebody asking if we needed anything from the store. I wasn't ready to believe all of that had been a setup. The next morning, Laura called. I've read the documents. I went into Thomas's old office and closed the door. Tell me I'm overreacting. I can't do that. That wasn't what I wanted to hear. She explained that nothing could happen to my house without my signature. I wasn't in immediate danger, but if you transferred it, it would become an LLC asset. Richard, as manager, would have broad authority under this agreement. To do what, among other things? Negotiate financing involving company assets. I stared out the window so he could borrow against it. There are details and limitations we'd need to examine, but that's the concern I would have before you transferred anything. I sat down. Laura asked, Has Richard mentioned needing collateral? No, a business loan? No. Any project? Having trouble? No. She was quiet. Then she said, I did find something you should see. Richard and Evan were both connected to a redevelopment project outside Dayton. That part wasn't news. Richard had talked about Dayton for nearly a year. What I didn't know was that the project had recently been seeking additional financing. Laura was careful not to make conclusions she couldn't support. She didn't have to. I thought about Evan sitting at my dining table, checking his watch twice. Suddenly, the hurry made sense. Maybe Bennett Family Holdings wasn't about what happened to my house after I died. Maybe it was about what Richard needed my house to do while I was very much alive. Laura didn't uncover some secret file that explained everything. I wish life worked that way. One folder, preferably labeled things your husband forgot to tell you, and you could be home by lunch. Instead, we spent the next 2 days putting together pieces that didn't look especially dramatic on their own. Richard and Evan's project outside Dayton had started with a plan that sounded reasonable enough. They'd bought an aging office complex with 2 other investors and intended to convert part of it into apartments, with restaurants and retail on the ground floor. Richard had shown me the architectural renderings months earlier, trees where there weren't any trees, young couples drinking coffee on balconies. A golden retriever in one picture, which apparently is required by law whenever developers want you to believe someplace will be pleasant. I'd told him it looked nice. What he hadn't told me was how badly the numbers had changed. Construction costs had climbed. A restaurant group pulled out. One investor refused to put in more money. The lender wanted additional financial support before extending the next round of financing. Laura estimated the immediate problem at roughly $2.8 million. I didn't need a course in commercial real estate to understand it. They'd bought something expensive with borrowed money. It wasn't earning what they'd promised. And now, everybody wanted somebody else to take the risk, including apparently me. Richard became remarkably attentive during those 2 days. Thursday morning, he made coffee before I got downstairs. There were flowers on the kitchen counter that afternoon. Friday, he brought home breakfast from a diner we liked. I finally looked at the flowers and said, You know, chrysanthemums don't fix legal documents. They're not supposed to. Then what are they doing? He gave me a tired smile. Being flowers. That almost got me. Richard had always been good at that. Bringing a conversation down from the ledge without making you feel foolish for being upset. I talked to Evan, he said, and he won't bother you again. That's not exactly the problem. I know. He sat across from me. I'll dissolve the LLC if that's what you want. I studied him just like that. Yes. Why? Because it was a bad idea. That was exactly what I wanted him to say, which made me suspicious of how relieved I felt hearing it. He reached for my hand. This time, I let him take it. I handled this badly, Maggie. Yes, you did. I know. For a few seconds, I could see a way back. Not all the way, but maybe far enough to start. Then Laura called Friday afternoon. Do you know a Carl Whitfield? The name was familiar. One of Richard's investors, former investor. Apparently, Carl Whitfield was 66, owned a chain of industrial supply businesses, and had the particular kind of confidence that comes from spending 40 years signing the front of checks instead of the back. I'd met him twice. He wasn't my friend that mattered. Carl hadn't contacted Laura because he wanted to rescue me. He and Richard were disputing what had been represented to investors about additional funding for Dayton. Carl was protecting Carl. I trusted that motive more than sudden heroism. What does he want? I asked to verify whether Richard had authority to represent additional family resources as potentially available. My stomach tightened. What family resources? He didn't specify, but there's something else. Months earlier, Evan had forwarded project correspondence to several people while rushing between meetings. Part of an internal exchange with Richard remained below the forwarded message. Carl had received it. At the time, he apparently hadn't cared about a conversation concerning Richard's future wife. Now he did. With Carl's permission, Laura sent me the relevant portion. I opened it on my laptop. The first message was from Evan, dated 6 weeks before my wedding. I read it, then read it again. Once you're married, she'll loosen up, start with the house. Don't mention anything else until she's used to sharing. I stopped there. Laura was still on the phone. Maggie, I'm here. Below Evan's message was Richard's reply. 4 words did most of the damage. She trusts me. Don't push too hard. I don't remember what Laura said next. I was looking at those words. She trusts me. Richard hadn't told Evan to stay out of our finances. He hadn't said I wasn't some account they could draw from. He hadn't even said, don't talk about my wife that way. He'd told him not to push too hard, as if the problem wasn't what they wanted, only how quickly they asked for it. I need to call you back, I said. Of course. I closed the laptop, then opened it again. There was more. Evan had written, even if Callahan only left her $5 or $6 million, that's enough to stabilize this. I stared at the screen, and then, God help me. I laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh, it just escaped. I called Denise, she answered. You okay? No good start. I read her the email, there was a pause. Then Denise said, wait, he thinks you have $5 million, maybe 6. Another pause. So they tried to rob Fort Knox because they thought it was a nice credit union. Denise, what I'm trying to be supportive. I laughed again. Then I didn't. Thomas and I hadn't started rich. When our daughter was little, I did payroll at the kitchen table after she went to bed. I handled benefits when the company had 11 employees. I once spent an entire Sunday calling customers because our billing software had corrupted a month's worth of invoices. Thomas built the company. So did a lot of people. And in my own less glamorous way, so did I. Years later, after we sold our controlling interest, the proceeds were invested. We still had commercial property. There was insurance after Thomas died. The investments kept growing. By the time I married Richard, the separate assets I controlled were worth a little over $43 million. Richard knew I was wealthy. Our prenup made sure neither of us entered marriage pretending otherwise. But my current net worth wasn't something I gave him quarterly updates on, and Evan clearly knew almost nothing. Apparently, he'd taken a few comments from his father, added confidence, and arrived at $5 or $6 million. That should have made the situation less frightening. Instead, it made it worse. They hadn't needed to know I had $43 million to start planning around my property. 5 was enough. That evening, I sat on the back porch until the mosquitoes decided I'd had enough reflection. There was one question I kept avoiding. If Richard had come to me 6 weeks before the wedding and said Maggie Dayton is in trouble, I may lose a lot of money. Would you consider helping me? What would I have said? I knew the answer. Probably yes, not blindly. Not $2.8 million dropped into his lap with a kiss and a casserole. I would have asked questions. Laura would have reviewed everything. There would have been protections, but I probably would have helped my husband. That was what hurt. Not that Richard wants something from me, that he decided asking honestly was less useful than managing me. My phone rang a little after 7. Richard. I let it ring twice before answering. Hi. His voice sounded different. No charm, no careful reassurance. Maggie, we need to talk about what Dayton. I waited. There's something I haven't told you. I looked through the kitchen window. His flowers were still on the counter. All right. I'll be home in about 40 minutes. We hung up. Less than 10 minutes later, Laura called. I received another document from Whitfield. I almost didn't want to know. What is it? A financing presentation Richard's team circulated, and there is a section describing potential sources of financial support. I stood very still. Laura read the phrase to me. Significant family liquidity available if required. I looked at the wedding ring on my hand. Then I asked the only question that mattered, whose family. Laura didn't answer. She didn't need to. Richard got home 32 minutes later. I know because I watched the clock. Not because I was waiting to catch him in something. I was still hoping he'd walk through that door and tell me enough truth to make the last few days look different. He found me at the kitchen table. The flowers he'd brought me were between us. Richard took off his jacket and sat down. I should have told you Dayton was in trouble. Yes. He rubbed both hands over his face. It wasn't supposed to get this bad. Things rarely are. He told me the rest. The project was running out of room. The lender wanted more support. Contractors were waiting on payments. Richard had personally guaranteed part of the debt. If the deal collapsed badly enough, he could lose a significant portion of what he'd spent 30 years building. Evan had money in it, too. How much do you need? I asked. Richard hesitated. Immediately, somewhere around 3 million, 2.8. His eyes lifted. That was the moment he realized I'd been asking questions of my own. Laura found that some of it. He leaned back. So you've got lawyers digging through my business now? No, I have a lawyer reviewing documents your son brought into my house. That's not the same thing. No, Richard, it isn't. He stood and walked toward the sink. I wasn't trying to take your house. I looked at him. Then why did a lawyer bring me papers transferring it? I wanted options. For whom? For us. There it is again. What us? I pointed toward the hallway. That word didn't appear anywhere in Bennett Family Holdings. He turned away. For a while, neither of us said anything. Then Richard sat down again. His voice changed. Creator. You know how many people are tied to this project. I know it's more than you and Evan. Contractors, employees, small investors, people who trusted me. That word didn't escape me. Trusted. Richard continued. If Dayton falls apart, this isn't just me losing money. I understand that. Do you? Yes. Because right now it feels like you're treating me like some guy who showed up at your door asking for a check. No. Your son did that. He flinched. I regretted the line almost as soon as I said it. Not because it wasn't true, because I didn't want every conversation between us to become a contest for the sharpest sentence. Richard stared down at the table. Then he said, if Thomas were alive and his company was in trouble, would you help him? That shut me up. He looked at me. Would you? Yes. There was no point lying. Thomas and I had risked everything together more than once. Early in the business, we'd borrowed against our first house to buy equipment. Of course, I would have helped him. Richard nodded. Then why am I different? I hated how reasonable the question sounded. You're not Thomas. I know that. And Thomas would have asked me. Richard's expression changed. I went on. He wouldn't have created a company without me, put himself in charge of it, then sent somebody over with papers for my house. I said I was sorry. I know. I'll dissolve the LLC. You already said that, and I'll keep Evan out of our finances. I looked at him. I mean it, Maggie. Part of me wanted to believe him so badly. I could almost feel myself leaning toward it. That's embarrassing now. It wasn't then. I had married this man because I loved him. 3 days didn't erase 18 months, and grief had taught me something people don't talk about much. Once you've lost marriage to death, you're not eager to throw another one away, even when common sense is clearing its throat in the corner. 2 days later, Richard and I sat in a counselor's office in Worthington. Her name was Dr. Susan Keller. She was probably around my age, wore sensible shoes, and had the unnerving habit of letting silence sit there until somebody finally told the truth just to get rid of it. Richard explained Dayton. He explained the financing deadline. He explained Evan. He explained that he'd intended to discuss everything with me. Susan listened. Then she asked, "Why didn't you ask Maggie before making plans involving her property?" Richard started talking about the lender. Susan waited. He moved on to the project deadline. She waited some more. Then Evan. Finally, she said, "Those things explain why you needed money." Richard stopped. "They don't explain why you didn't ask your wife." There was a long silence. I looked at Richard. He stared at the carpet. Finally, he said, "I thought she'd say no." That was probably the most honest thing he'd told me all week. I said, "You never gave me the chance." "I know, and I believed he understood. At least I wanted to." The next couple of days weren't easy. People had begun hearing that the Dayton project was in trouble. One woman we knew from a neighborhood dinner stopped me outside the grocery store. "Richard must be under terrible pressure." "He is." She touched my arm. "Marriage is a partnership, Maggie." I knew what she meant. She didn't know enough to mean anything cruel by it. Still, I sat in my SUV afterward for 10 minutes. $43 million. That number had started feeling less like security, and more like an accusation. I could solve Richard's immediate problem, not casually. $3 million is $3 million no matter what you're worth. But I could do it without losing my home or wondering how I'd pay for groceries. Maybe refusing to help, simply because he'd asked badly, was its own kind of pride. That night, I almost called Laura. I had even worked out what I'd say. A secured loan, independent appraisal, no control over my other assets, no Evan, everything documented. I never made the call. The following afternoon, Laura called me first. Carl Whitfield contacted me again. I closed my eyes. What now? Richard met with another potential financing group yesterday. I sat up. Yesterday? Yes, yesterday was the day we'd left counseling. What did he tell them? The revised material is more careful. That didn't reassure me. Laura read the wording. Additional family resources under discussion. I stared at the wall. Under discussion. Technically, I suppose that was clever. Richard and I certainly had discussed my money, mostly in sentences beginning with, "Why did you?" But nothing was available. Nothing had been offered. And after counseling, he knew exactly where I stood. That evening I waited until we'd finished dinner. "Did you meet another lender yesterday?" Richard didn't even look surprised. "No, I watched him. Maybe Laura had the date wrong. Maybe Carl did." I gave Richard an exit. "Think before you answer me again." Now he looked at me. "Maggie, did you meet with another financing group yesterday?" No. The strange thing is I didn't get angry. Something simply settled. The LLC had frightened me. The email had hurt me. But this was different. Richard knew I knew enough to ask the question. He'd sat beside me in counseling less than 24 hours earlier and admitted he should have asked rather than planned around me, and now he was lying directly to my face twice. I nodded. "All right," he frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm tired." I went upstairs. The next morning after Richard left, I called Laura. "I need a family law attorney." She was quiet for a second. "Are you sure?" "No." That answer surprised both of us. Then I said, "But I'm sure I can't stay married while I wait to become sure." Laura gave me a referral. With counsel, I began the process of ending the marriage under the prenup. I also authorized formal notices, making one thing absolutely clear. None of my separate assets, my house investment accounts, property interests, anything were available as collateral guarantees or financial support for the Dayton project. I didn't call Richard's investors. I didn't threaten his business. I didn't demand anybody punish him. I simply removed my name and my money from a story I had never agreed to be part of. A few days later, Carl forwarded another investor presentation to Laura. Richard and Evan were making one last major pitch at a private luncheon in downtown Columbus. Most of the wording about family resources had disappeared. Most one line remained. Family financial capacity provides additional downside protection. I read it 3 times. Apparently, even after everything, my silence was still being treated like something Richard could spend. So, I called Laura. "I want that corrected. It will be." "No." I looked at the page again. "I mean, I want them to hear it from me." For the first time since Evan walked through my front door with that folder, I wasn't wondering what Richard was going to do next. I knew what I was going to do. Laura did not love my idea. "I understand why you want to be there," she said. "That doesn't mean you walk into a private investor meeting uninvited." I wasn't planning to kick down the door. "I know. I don't even own boots suitable for that." She ignored me, which was one of the reasons I paid her. Instead, she contacted counsel for the financing group and told them I disputed any suggestion that my separate assets were available to support the Dayton project. That got their attention. By Monday afternoon, they wanted clarification directly from me, so I was invited to attend part of the meeting. Not quite the dramatic entrance I might have imagined at 30. At 57, I've learned that being expected is often more useful than being dramatic. The meeting was a Wednesday at 11:30 in a conference room at a large hotel in downtown Columbus. Laura met me in the lobby. "You okay?" she asked. "No good." I looked at her. She smiled slightly. People who say they're fine before meetings like this usually aren't paying attention. There were maybe 20 people in the room. Investors, lawyers, 2 lender renter representatives, Richard's business partner, Carl Whitfield, and Evan. Richard was standing near a screen displaying a rendering of the Dayton project. When I walked in, he saw me immediately. His expression changed. "Maggie, Richard, what are you doing here?" I looked past him at the screen. The words capital structure were printed across the top. Apparently, I'm part of the capital structure. Evan turned toward his father. Richard lowered his voice. "Can we talk outside?" Laura answered before I did. After the clarification, that was another reason I paid her. We sat at the far end of the table. Nobody yelled. Nobody threatened anybody. In real life, the rooms where people can lose millions of dollars are often disappointingly quiet. One of the lender representatives, a man named Mark Ellison, opened a folder. "Mrs. Bennett, thank you for coming. We need clarity on one issue." Of course, he looked toward Richard. "Mr. Bennett, our understanding from prior materials was that additional families' financial resources might be available if necessary." Richard leaned forward. "I think that language has been interpreted more broadly than intended." Mark didn't react. "Are your wife's separate assets available to support this transaction?" Richard glanced at me. "We've been discussing several possibilities." "No." The word came out before I had time to dress it up. Everybody looked at me. I kept my voice level. "My separate assets are not available to support this project." Richard shifted in his chair. "Maggie, that's not entirely, it is entirely accurate." Laura touched the edge of her folder but didn't interrupt. I continued. "I have never agreed to pledge my home. I have never agreed to guarantee project debt. I have never authorized my investment accounts or property interests to be presented as financial support for Dayton." Mark looked at Richard. Richard said, "No one is claiming there's a binding commitment." "That isn't what I asked," Mark said. Carl leaned back in his chair. I could almost hear Denise in my head saying, "Well, this is going nicely." Richard tried again. The phrase family resources was intended to communicate overall financial stability. "Maggie and I are married. Obviously, we've discussed," Evan interrupted. "This is ridiculous." Richard turned. "Evan, no, Dad, it is." Evan looked directly at me. "We're talking about an entire development here. Contractors, investors, people's jobs, and she's sitting on money her first husband left her, because she's mad about some paperwork." "Stop," Richard said. Evan didn't. That was Evan's problem. He was a man who thought the next sentence would rescue the previous one. It rarely did. "What are we even arguing about?" He said 5,000,006. The room went very still. I looked at Richard. He looked embarrassed, not surprised. That's when I understood that Richard had never told his son what I was actually worth. Maybe he didn't know the exact number himself. Our prenup had disclosed substantial separate property, but my finances hadn't stopped moving the day we signed it. Investments grew, properties changed value, accounts were consolidated. I didn't send Richard quarterly net worth reports, and apparently Evan had built an entire strategy around a gas. My hand was wrapped around the water glass in front of me. I realized I was gripping it hard enough that my fingers hurt, so I set it down. "My separate assets are currently worth a little over $43 million. Nobody moved. Evan blinked. "43 million? Yes." He stared at me. "You have $43 million. It didn't change in the last 6 seconds, Evan. Someone at the other end of the table coughed into his hand. Carl looked down, but I could see him smiling. I hadn't meant to be funny. Well, maybe a little. Richard wasn't smiling. He looked at me in a way I hadn't seen before. You never told me. This meeting isn't about what I told you. 43 million. Maggie Mark cut in Mr. Bennett. The amount isn't actually our concern exactly. That was the strange part. The number sounded enormous in the room, but it wasn't the problem. The problem was whether Richard had been presenting access to money he didn't control. Laura took over. She explained that I was there, only to clarify my position and correct any implication that my separate property represented additional support for the project. Then the email came up. Carl had already provided the relevant correspondence in connection with his dispute over the financing representations. Mark read from his copy. I didn't need to look. I knew the words. Start with the house. Then Richard's reply. She trusts me. Don't push too hard. Richard leaned forward. That conversation is being taken completely out of context. Carl finally spoke. What context improves it? Richard looked at him. Evan was talking about integrating family finances after the marriage. Evan said, exactly. I turned to him by starting with my house. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. For once, the next sentence failed to arrive. Richard tried to explain that the LLC had never received my property. That was true. He pointed out that no lender had ever been given a guarantee from me. Also true. Laura didn't argue those facts. Neither did I. The investors weren't deciding whether Richard had committed some crime. They were deciding whether they trusted the way he'd represented financial support. One of them, a gray-haired woman who hadn't spoken all morning, closed her folder. I'd like our participation suspended pending further diligence. Another investor nodded. Mark said the financing group would need revised materials and additional review before proceeding. Nobody pounded a table. Nobody announced that Richard Bennett was ruined. The mood simply changed. People stopped looking at him like a man who had brought them a solution. They started looking at him like a man whose numbers needed checking. If you've ever worked in business, you know how expensive that change can be. I stood. Laura stood with me. Richard followed us into the hallway. Maggie. I kept walking until we were away from the conference room door. Then I turned. He looked tired, older somehow. Why didn't you tell you what that it was 43? You knew I had money, not that kind of money. I stared at him. Would it have made you behave better? He didn't answer. That wasn't rhetorical, Richard. I don't know. At least that was honest. He looked toward the conference room, then back at me. If I'd come to you before all this, if I just told you Dayton was in trouble and asked you for help, would you have? That was the question I'd already asked myself. I could have lied. It would have been satisfying for about 5 seconds. Instead, I said, probably. His face changed. I would have wanted protections. I would have had Laura look at everything. I wouldn't have handed Evan a blank check. Of course, but yes, I probably would have helped you. Richard looked down. I said quietly, that's the part I can't fix for you. I turned toward the elevators. Evan came out of the conference room behind us. He wasn't angry anymore. That almost made him look younger. So what happens to us now? Richard closed his eyes. I looked at Evan. I don't know. You could still help. There it was. Even now, not I'm sorry. Not. We were wrong. You could still help. I pressed the elevator button. Evan, that's what happens when your backup plan turns out to be a person. The doors opened. Laura and I stepped inside. I held myself together until they closed. Then I reached for the railing along the wall. My hands were shaking. Laura didn't say anything. She didn't tell me I'd been brave. She didn't tell me I'd won. She just stood beside me while we went down 18 floors. I was grateful for that, because I didn't feel victorious. I felt like I'd just watched a marriage end in a conference room full of strangers. And even when ending it is the right thing to do, there's nothing particularly victorious about that. The Dayton project didn't collapse that afternoon. Richard didn't lose everything before dinner. Evan wasn't marched out of the building, carrying a cardboard box. Real consequences usually take longer than that. Over the next few months, the project was restructured. Richard and his partners brought in additional oversight, sold off part of their interest, and accepted terms they would have laughed at a year earlier. Richard took a painful loss. Not ruinous, painful. Evan ended up leaving the project entirely. The last I heard, he'd taken a salaried position with another development company in Cincinnati. Denise called when she heard, so Evan has a boss now, apparently. Somebody who isn't his father. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. That poor boss. I laughed. I shouldn't have, but I did. My divorce from Richard was considerably less entertaining. The prenup did what a good prenup is supposed to do. It didn't punish anybody. It didn't reward anybody. It simply made clear what belonged to whom. My separate property remained mine. Richard kept his. There was no $20 million settlement, no courtroom full of people gasping. No judge leaned over the bench and gave Richard a speech about respecting women. Mostly there were emails, documents, phone calls, signatures. One afternoon, I spent 45 minutes discussing how to divide 2 sets of patio furniture. That's divorce for you, $43 million in assets, and somehow you still end up debating who bought the outdoor cushions. Richard moved out before everything was final. The first night after he'd taken the last of his clothes, I walked through the house, turning off lights. When I reached the guest room, I stopped. His reading glasses were sitting on the nightstand, the cheap pair he used at night. I picked them up. For one stupid second, I nearly called him. Not because I wanted him back. I just knew he'd need them. That's the problem with loving somebody. Your habits don't receive legal notice when the marriage ends. I put the glasses in a padded envelope the next morning and mailed them to his office. No note. About 3 months later, an envelope arrived for me. Richard's handwriting. I left it on the counter until after dinner. Then I opened it. The letter was 4 pages long. He didn't ask me to come back. That surprised me. He didn't blame Evan either. That surprised me more. Richard wrote that he'd spent weeks trying to figure out when he'd crossed the line. He said he had loved me when he proposed. I believed that he'd known I was financially secure. Obviously, our prenup had made that impossible to miss. But when Dayton began going bad, he'd started thinking about what my money could solve. At first, Maggie could help me. Then Maggie should help me. Eventually, of course, Maggie will help me. By the time Evan suggested starting with the house, Richard had already convinced himself that the problem wasn't whether I wanted to help. It was how to get me comfortable enough to do it. There was one sentence in the letter I read several times. I turned your security into my contingency plan. That was probably the closest he ever came to understanding it. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. I didn't answer, not because I hated him. By then, I didn't. That's another thing nobody tells you. Sometimes it's easier when the person who hurt you was secretly terrible all along. Richard wasn't. He could be generous, funny, patient. He's beside me through the anniversary of Thomas's death, without once acting threatened by a dead man. He knew exactly how I liked my coffee, and always remembered that I hated cilantro, and he still betrayed me. People can love you and behave selfishly. Both things can be true. Accepting that was harder than deciding who got the patio furniture. For a while, I became cautious about money in ways I didn't like. Every time somebody mentioned a charity investment loan, or even an expensive dinner, I noticed myself tightening up. Then one afternoon, Denise and I were reviewing some paperwork from a scholarship fund Thomas and I had started years earlier. It was small. Originally, we'd created it for employees' children. I was reading an application from a 52-year-old woman who'd spent nearly 20 years caring for her children and then her mother. Now, she wanted to train as a respiratory therapist. I read her application twice. Then I called the administrator. Over the following months, I expanded the program. Nothing grandiose. I didn't give away half my estate to prove a point. We simply widened eligibility to women over 45 returning to community college certification programs or vocational training after years spent raising children, caring for family, or rebuilding after losing a spouse. I also set aside money for emergency grants benefiting families connected to Thomas's old company. When I told Denise, she stared at me across lunch. So, let me understand this. That usually worries me. You just spent months keeping people away from your money. Yes, and now you're giving some of it away also. Yes, she pointed her fork at me. Explain. There's a difference between opening your hand and somebody reaching into your pocket. Denise stopped chewing. Then she nodded. That's good, thank you. You should put that on a coffee mug. Then you'd make me pay $18 for it. 22. It's a fundraiser. That was the first time in months I'd laughed about money without feeling something sour underneath it. On what would have been our 34th wedding anniversary, I drove out to the cemetery where Thomas was buried. I didn't bring Richard's letter. I didn't have a speech prepared. I just stood there for a while. Thomas used to say something when our business was young and things went wrong. Watch what people do when they think you need them. Back then, he meant vendors, banks, customers. Standing there that afternoon, I realized my second marriage had taught me the other half. Watch what people do when they think they need something from you. Thomas hadn't just left me money. We had spent 32 years learning what money could and couldn't do inside a marriage. We'd argued about it, risked it, saved it, lost some, made more. But neither of us ever treated the other person's consent as an inconvenience. That was the difference. A few weeks after the divorce became final, I stopped at a small cafe outside Columbus on a Saturday morning. I took a table by the window, coffee, 2 eggs, toast, an actual newspaper because I'm 57, and I refused to apologize for certain things. I was halfway through the local section when the waitress came over with the coffee pot. More, please. She filled my cup, then picked up the extra place setting across from me. Just one today. I looked at the empty chair. There had been a time after Thomas died when that question would have followed me home. Then Richard came along, and I'd thought having somebody in that chair meant I'd escaped something. Now I knew better. I smiled at her, just me. She took the extra silverware and moved on. I went back to my newspaper, and for the first time in a very long while, the word just didn't sound like something was missing. It sounded like enough. I used to think trust meant having nothing to hide. I don't anymore. Trust is knowing that when somebody discovers what you have, they don't immediately start calculating what part of it should belong to them. Richard lost more than access to my money. He lost the woman who probably would have helped him if he'd simply treated her like his wife. And I learned something, too. Protecting yourself doesn't make you cold. Generosity only means something when it's your choice. If you've ever had somebody mistake your kindness for permission, tell me what you would have done in my place. And if you'd like to stay for another story, I'd be glad to have the courtroom doors were still swinging shut behind me when I heard him laugh. Not loud, just a low, satisfied sound, the kind a man makes when he's won something he never should have been fighting for in the first place. I stood on the courthouse steps in my dress blues, $22 in my checking account, and a wedding ring I still hadn't taken off, because some stubborn part of me hadn't caught up with reality yet. 90 seconds later, a stranger in a gray wool coat stopped me on the sidewalk and asked if I was Lieutenant Lucy Price. I said yes. She said my aunt had just died and left me $50 million. Then she said there was a catch. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. I didn't cry in that courtroom. 14 years in the Army teaches you how to keep your face still when everything underneath it is on fire. And I'd had a lot of practice by the time Judge Ferris read the final terms of my divorce out loud like she was reading a grocery list. The house gone. Most of our joint savings gone. A settlement figure that made my stomach drop because it wasn't in my favor. It was against me. Like I was the one who'd done something wrong. I sat there in my uniform spine, straight hands folded, and I let the words wash over me, the way you let artillery fire wash over you in a briefing. You don't flinch. You just take the information in, and you figure out how you're going to survive it. Daniel didn't even look at me during most of it. He sat next to Richard Coleman, his lawyer, a man with a $2 Sowens suit and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. And the two of them murmured to each other like men closing a business deal, which I understood later was exactly what it was. But that morning, I still thought I was watching my marriage end. I didn't know yet that I was watching the opening move of something much bigger. When the judge finished and it was over, actually over 13 years of my life, reduced to a signature on a piece of paper, I stood up because that's what you do. You stand up, you walk out, you don't let them see you shake. Daniel caught my arm near the door, not hard, just enough to stop me, and he leaned in close enough that I could smell his cologne. the same one he'd worn on our wedding day. And he said, "You always thought being a soldier made you untouchable." I didn't answer him. There wasn't an answer that would have mattered. I just pulled my arm free and walked out into the cold Chicago air like it was any other Tuesday. Even though nothing about that Tuesday was ordinary, I stood on those steps for a minute, just breathing. The sky was that flat gray you get in early spring, the kind that makes the whole city look like it's holding its breath. I remember thinking very clearly that I had exactly $240 to my name if you counted the change in my car's cup holder, and that I was 38 years old and starting over from nothing, and that somehow I was going to have to figure out how to do that with dignity. Because dignity was the only thing left that Daniel hadn't managed to take from me in that room. That's when I noticed her. A woman, maybe 60-65, silver hair pulled back, neat a wool coat that looked like it cost more than my entire wardrobe, standing near the bottom of the steps, like she'd been waiting there specifically for me. She wasn't part of the crowd filing out of the courthouse. She was watching me the way you watch someone you've been sent to find. "Excuse me," she said, stepping forward. "Are you Lieutenant Lucy Price?" I nodded, wary. In my line of work, you learn to be careful about strangers who already know your name and your rank. "My name is Margaret Bell," she said. "I'm an attorney. I represent the estate of Eleanor Price." She paused, and something in her face softened the practiced compassion of someone who has delivered this kind of news more than once. "Your aunt passed away 6 days ago." I felt the ground tilt a little. Eleanor, my father's sister, the aunt in Chicago I hadn't seen in almost 4 years. Not since a wedding that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. We used to talk on the phone less and less, as the years went on, my fault as much as anyone's. The way distance just accumulates quietly until you look up and realize how much time has passed. I hadn't even known she was sick. "I'm so sorry," Margaret said, and I believed she meant it. "I know this is a difficult day for you already." She glanced just briefly toward the courthouse doors, toward where Daniel and Richard were still standing on the steps above us, and something in that glance told me she knew exactly what had just happened inside that building. "Your aunt left you her mansion here in Chicago," she continued, "along with an estate valued at nearly $50 million. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because my brain simply refused to process it as real information. $50 million on the same morning I'd walked out of a courtroom with less than 300. It felt like a cruel joke, like the universe deciding to see how much irony one Tuesday could hold. "There is one condition," Margaret said, and her voice changed just slightly, the practiced gentleness, giving way to something more careful, more deliberate. "What condition?" I asked. She looked past me again toward the courthouse. Steps toward the man I'd just divorced, and the lawyer who'd helped him take almost everything I had. And then she said the words that I would replay in my head for weeks afterward. Words that I didn't understand the full weight of until much, much later. "You cannot inherit a single dollar," she said, "unless you do exactly what your aunt asked you to do." I had no idea what that meant. I had no idea that the woman standing in front of me was about to hand me a wooden box that would unravel everything I thought I knew about my marriage, about my aunt, and about the very careful, very quiet war that had been waged against me long before I ever stepped foot in that courtroom. To understand why Eleanor's condition mattered so much, I have to take you back, further back to the beginning of my marriage. Because none of what happened outside that courthouse makes sense without it. I met Daniel when I was 26. A young officer with more ambition than sense. And he was charming in a way that felt effortless, the kind of charm that made you feel like the only person in a crowded room. In the early years, he seemed genuinely proud of me. He'd introduced me at parties as my wife, the lieutenant, and there was warmth in it, or at least I believed there was. I was deployed twice in our first 6 years together, and both times he wrote me letters, real ones on paper, which felt old-fashioned and sweet in a way that made the distance easier to bear. But something shifted around year 8. I got promoted. I was given a leadership position that came with more responsibility, more travel, more of my superiors trusting me with things that mattered. And instead of being proud, Daniel started to seem smaller around me, quieter in a way that wasn't peaceful, it was resentful. He started making comments that were technically jokes, but never quite landed as jokes. "You're married to the army, not me," he said once at a dinner with his coworkers, and everyone laughed except me, because I could hear what was underneath it. The control crept in slowly, the way water gets into a foundation. So gradually you don't notice the damage until the whole structure is compromised. He started asking more questions about my income, about my retirement accounts, about the life insurance policy the army required me to carry. He framed it as concern as a husband being responsible about their shared future. I believed him because why wouldn't I? I trusted him the way you trust someone you've built a decade of your life around. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that somewhere in that same stretch of time, Daniel had quietly begun meeting with Richard Coleman. Not as a friend, as a client. He was building a case against me, before I even knew there was a case to be made. He was documenting things, twisting ordinary moments into evidence, laying groundwork for an ending I hadn't agreed to, and didn't see coming. It was around this time that I called my Aunt Eleanor, mostly just to hear a familiar voice after a rough deployment cycle. Eleanor had a way of listening that made you feel like she was hearing the sentence underneath your sentence. She'd been through a bad marriage herself decades earlier, something she rarely talked about, but that had clearly left her sharp-eyed about the warning signs other people missed. 10 minutes into our call, she stopped me mid-sentence. "Lucy," she said, "are you happy?" "I'm fine." I told her the way women tell people they're fine when they've stopped examining the question too closely because they're afraid of the answer. "That's what women say," Eleanor said quietly, "when they're trying not to admit they're not." I brushed it off. I told her Daniel and I were just going through a hard patch, that marriages have seasons. That this was ours. Eleanor didn't argue with me. But she did something I didn't fully appreciate at the time. She told me to make copies of my financial documents, to know exactly what accounts existed in my name and what existed in his, to never assume that love meant safety. I remember feeling almost defensive on Daniel's behalf, telling her she didn't know him the way I did. She let it go, but she didn't forget it, and neither I would learn did she stop watching. Now, standing outside that courthouse with Margaret Bell in front of me, all of that came rushing back with a different weight to it. Margaret suggested we get somewhere private to talk, and within the hour, I was in the back of a car heading north toward Chicago, watching the city blur past the window, while she filled in the parts of the story I didn't know. Eleanor had been sick for almost a year, she told me. Pancreatic cancer diagnosed quietly, treated quietly because that was Eleanor's way. She never wanted anyone fussing over her. And in that final year, knowing her time was limited, she had done something deliberate. She had begun preparing her estate, not just financially, but strategically. She suspected, Margaret said carefully, that my marriage might not survive. She'd seen the signs even from a distance. The way I'd stopped mentioning Daniel in our calls, the way my voice had gotten smaller over the years whenever his name came up. The estate itself was staggering when Margaret laid it out. The mansion in Chicago's Gold Coast, one Eleanor had lived in for over 30 years, shares in a company Eleanor's late husband had built. Investment accounts that had compounded quietly for decades. Real estate holdings scattered across 3 states. A trust fund that, when everything was totaled, came to just under $50 million. But it wasn't mine yet. Not automatically. Margaret explained that Eleanor's will included specific conditions I would need to meet, and the first one was straightforward on its surface. I had to move into the mansion and live there for 12 full months. During that time, I would need to complete a task Eleanor had left for me, something Margaret said she wasn't yet authorized to explain in detail. Instead, she reached into her bag and handed me a small wooden box, worn smooth at the corners, like it had been handled many times, and told me Eleanor had asked that I open it alone when I was ready. Inside, resting on top of what looked like folders and photographs, was a sealed envelope with my name written across it in Eleanor's careful handwriting. I opened it right there in the car. The first line hit me like a physical blow. "My dear Lucy, if you're reading this, the man you married has already shown you who he really is. I looked up at Margaret. She was watching me, with an expression I couldn't quite name, somewhere between sympathy and warning, and I understood in that moment that whatever Eleanor had left me wasn't just an inheritance. It was a message, and I was only just beginning to understand what it was trying to tell me. I didn't read the rest of the letter in the car. Some part of me needed solid ground under my feet first. Needed 4 walls and a locked door before I let myself absorb whatever else Eleanor had left behind. Margaret seemed to understand that without my having to say it. She let the silence sit between us for the remainder of the drive. And when we finally pulled up to the mansion, a limestone building on a quiet tree-lined street that looked like it belonged in a different century, she simply told me to take my time and that she'd be in the study whenever I was ready to talk. I sat alone in what had been Eleanor's sitting room, afternoon light slanting through tall windows, and I opened the box fully for the first time. Beneath the letter were folders neatly labeled in Eleanor's handwriting, copies of emails, financial records I didn't recognize, a handful of photographs, slightly grainy, clearly taken from a distance, of Daniel meeting with a man I'd never seen before, in what looked like a hotel lobby, documents referencing an investment firm I'd never heard my husband mention. And at the bottom, a USB drive, small and unlabeled, sitting there like a quiet accusation. I kept reading Eleanor's letter, and the tone shifted from tender to clinical. The way a woman writes, when she's forcing herself to stay factual about something that terrifies her. She wrote that she hadn't believed, not for a second, that my marriage had simply grown apart. The phrase Daniel had apparently used when he'd last spoken to her. Eleanor had never trusted easy explanations. She'd hired a private investigator almost a year earlier, not out of paranoia, she wrote, but out of something closer to instinct, the kind that comes from having survived her own version of a man who wanted more than he was willing to earn. What the investigator found had confirmed her worst suspicion. Daniel hadn't just been building a divorce case against me. He had also at some point learned about Eleanor. Not casually, deliberately. He'd made inquiries, subtle ones, about her health, about the value of her holdings, about whether she had children of her own who might stand to inherit ahead of me. He had, in other words, known long before I did, that there was a fortune sitting at the end of this story, and he had positioned himself accordingly. I sat very still with that information for a long moment, feeling something cold settle into my chest, and then I remembered it. A memory that had been sitting dormant in the back of my mind for over a year suddenly sharpened into focus. We'd been at dinner maybe 18 months earlier, and Daniel had asked almost offhand, stirring his wine like the question meant nothing. "Your aunt really doesn't have children, does she?" I'd answered without thinking, said no. Eleanor never remarried after her husband passed, no kids. At the time it had seemed like idle curiosity. Now it felt like reconnaissance. Margaret came in partway through my reading, carrying 2 cups of tea. Neither of us touched, and confirmed what the document suggested. Eleanor's investigator had traced a pattern of contact between Daniel and an outside party interested in acquiring property in the neighborhood. Property that included this very mansion. The offers had come in low, well below market value, dressed up as generous. Eleanor had turned them down without much thought at the time, assuming it was simple opportunism. She hadn't yet connected it to her nephew. My phone rang while I was still absorbing all of it. Daniel's name lit up the screen and my stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with dread. I almost didn't answer, but some stubborn instinct in me wanted to hear what he'd say, wanted to know how quickly he'd move. "Lucy," he said, his voice carrying that particular warmth he used when he wanted something. "I heard about your aunt. I'm sorry." A pause just long enough to feel calculated. "Whatever she left you, remember that we're still legally tied up financially. Some of those old joint accounts, the settlement terms, it's complicated." "We're divorced, Daniel," I said, keeping my voice as flat and even as I could manage. He laughed softly, the sound of a man who thought he still had the upper hand. "The divorce doesn't erase everything," he said. I hung up without responding, my hand shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the sudden sharp clarity of understanding exactly what he was doing. He wasn't calling to grieve with me. He was calling to stake a claim before the ink on the will had even dried testing. Whether there was still a door left open, he could push through. I went back to Eleanor's letter, and near the end, her handwriting grew smaller, more deliberate, like she'd been choosing every word with care. "Don't fight him with anger, Lucy," she'd written. "Fight him with proof," and then underlined twice. Do not tell Daniel anything about what is in this box. Not yet. Let him believe you know nothing." I sat with that instruction for a while, understanding for the first time that my aunt hadn't just left me money, she'd left me a strategy. That night, alone in the mansion study, I finally plugged the USB drive into an old laptop Margaret had left for me. A video file loaded, and Eleanor's face appeared on the screen, thinner than I remembered, sitting in this same room, speaking directly into the camera, with the steady composure that had defined her entire life. "Lucy," she said, her voice a little rougher than I remembered, but unmistakably hers. "If Daniel ever contacts you after my death, do not trust him." She paused, and something flickered across her face, something that looked almost like fear, which was strange to see on a woman I'd never once seen rattled. "Because he isn't the only person you need to worry about." The video ended there. The room went quiet except for the soft hum of the old radiator and the sound of my own heartbeat, which felt suddenly very loud in my ears. I sat in the dark for a long time after that, staring at the frozen last frame of my aunt's face, understanding that whatever was coming next was bigger than a bitter ex-husband trying to claw back what he'd already lost. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the laptop open on the desk beside me, Eleanor's frozen face still on the screen, and I went through every document in that box until the sun came up over the lake. By morning, I had a legal pad covered in names, dates, and connections, the same way I used to build intelligence briefings back when I was still in uniform, treating my own marriage like a case file, because that was the only way I could keep my hands from shaking while I worked. Margaret and I sat down together in the study once she arrived, and we went through it, piece by piece. The photographs of Daniel meeting the unfamiliar man turned out to be more significant than I'd first understood. Margaret recognized the man immediately from a separate set of records Eleanor's investigator had compiled. His name was Grant Whitfield, and he ran a small but aggressive real estate acquisition firm that specialized in exactly the kind of undervalued, high-potential properties that made up a good portion of Eleanor's estate, including this mansion. What made my stomach turn wasn't just that Daniel had met with him. Snorts. It was who had introduced them. Richard Coleman, my ex-husband's divorce attorney, the same man who had stood beside Daniel in that courtroom looking so satisfied with himself, had financial ties to Whitfield's firm. Margaret found records of consulting fees small enough to seem unremarkable on their own, but consistent, going back nearly 2 years. Here is what I started to understand, sitting in that study with the morning light coming through the tall windows. The divorce hadn't just been Daniel deciding he no longer wanted to be married to me. It had been the opening move in something larger. Push me out of the marriage while I still had assets worth fighting over. Weaken me financially and emotionally right as I was approaching what would eventually be a $50 million inheritance. And then, once I was disoriented and depleted, apply pressure to sell or sign away pieces of what I'd inherited before I fully understood their value. It was almost elegant in its cruelty. Divorce me first, so that by the time Eleanor's estate came into play, I'd be too exhausted, too financially strained, too eager for stability to think clearly about what I was signing. Eleanor, it turned out, had seen pieces of this coming long before I did. Margaret showed me records of a lowball offer Eleanor had received on the mansion nearly a year earlier. An offer she'd waved off at the time, as nothing more than an aggressive real estate agent testing the waters. She hadn't known then that it traced back to Whitfield, and through him to Richard, and through Richard to the man I was still on paper tangled up with financially. I remember sitting very still after Margaret laid all of this out, feeling something shift inside my chest, a kind of cold, clear resolve, replacing the numbness I'd been carrying since the courthouse. I had spent 13 years married to the man I thought I understood. And it was only now in the wreckage of that marriage that I was starting to see the actual architecture of what had been built around me the whole time. "I want to be honest with you about something." There was a version of me that morning that wanted to call Daniel and scream at him, wanted to drive to wherever he was and demand to know how long he'd been planning this, how much of our marriage had been real, and how much had simply been reconnaissance. But Eleanor's voice kept coming back to me. Fight him with proof, not anger. And underneath that, something else. Something that felt like the version of myself I'd built in uniform. The officer who didn't react, who gathered information first and acted second. So instead of confronting anyone, I started building. I requested full account histories on anything connected to my marriage. I asked Margaret to bring in a forensic accountant. I began constructing a timeline cross-referencing dates from Daniel's emails against dates from the divorce proceedings, looking for the exact moment his behavior had shifted from a man drifting away from his marriage to a man actively engineering its collapse. It was during this process that Margaret introduced me to Sam Carter, a former financial investigator who had worked with Eleanor for years and who, it turned out, Eleanor had specifically asked to be available to me if I ever needed him. Sam was in his 50s, quiet, the kind of person who listened twice as much as he spoke, and within an hour of meeting him, I understood why Eleanor had trusted him. Sam told me something that changed the entire shape of what I was dealing with. Eleanor, anticipating exactly this kind of scenario, had built protective language into the trust itself, a kind of legal tripwire. If anyone Daniel Richard Whitfield or anyone acting on their behalf attempted to pressure me into selling, transferring, or compromising the estate within that first 12-month window, specific clauses in the trust would automatically trigger clauses that would not only protect the assets, but would expose exactly who had attempted to interfere. My aunt, it turned out, hadn't just left me money. She'd left me a trap built with the same patience and precision she'd used to build everything else in her life. And she'd built it specifically with Daniel in mind, even if she'd never had the chance to prove exactly what he'd done. Then Sam handed me one more piece of evidence, something Eleanor's investigator had obtained in the final weeks before her death. An audio recording a conversation between Daniel and Richard. The two of them speaking with the kind of casual confidence men have when they don't think anyone else is listening. I sat in that study, and I listened to my ex-husband's voice come through the speaker calm, almost pleased with himself. Once she gets the inheritance, he said she'll have nowhere left to run. I didn't cry when I heard it. I didn't feel the urge to. Something in me had already moved past the grief of that sentence and into something steadier, something that felt for the first time since I'd walked out of that courthouse, like the ground under my feet again. Then let's see, I said quietly to no one in particular, where they run when the truth comes out. I want to tell you something about how I was trained to fight because it matters for what happened next. In the army, they don't teach you to charge in swinging. They teach you patience. They teach you that the person who moves first out of anger usually loses. And the person who waits, who watches, who lets the other side reveal their hand, that person walks away standing. That was the lesson I carried into the weeks that followed. And it was the lesson that let me sit across from Daniel and Richard and let them believe for a little while longer that I was exactly as lost and desperate as they wanted me to be. I stopped returning Daniel's calls right away. I let a day pass, then too long enough that when I finally did pick up, my voice sounded tired and uncertain, which wasn't entirely an act. Some of it was real. But I let him hear more of it than there actually was. He softened immediately the way people do when they think they found a crack to work with. He told me he was worried about me. He said he just wanted to make sure I wasn't overwhelmed by everything happening with the estate. That inheritance law was complicated, that he'd hate to see me make a mistake I couldn't undo. Around the same time, Richard sent a formal letter to Margaret's office, warning that certain debts from the marriage debts I knew for a fact had already been settled in the divorce might still attach to any new assets I acquired. It was legally shaky at best, the kind of letter designed to frighten rather than to hold up in court. But it was calculated to make me feel cornered, to make me reach for the nearest hand offering help. I let them think it worked. I agreed to meet Daniel alone at a coffee shop not far from the mansion. He picked the place, which told me something to a location he was comfortable in, somewhere he thought he had the advantage. I dressed plainly. I let my hands look a little unsteady around the coffee cup. I let him talk first. "We can settle this between us," he said, leaning forward with that same warmth he used to use on me back when I still believed it meant something. "No lawyers, no more courtrooms, just us figuring it out like adults." "What do you want, Daniel?" I asked him. He said he only wanted to make sure we were both protected. That with an estate this size, there were tax implications, liability issues, things I might not have thought through on my own, and that he'd feel better if we came to some kind of private arrangement before things got, in his words, more complicated. What Daniel didn't know was that I wasn't just sitting there listening. On the advice of my legal team, I was recording every word of that conversation through a device Margaret had arranged entirely within the law, entirely admissible. And Daniel, comfortable and a little too pleased with how well he thought this was going, made a mistake. He referenced Eleanor's declining health, referenced it with specific detail, timelines that lined up almost perfectly with the private investigator's findings, timelines that he could only have known if he'd been actively tracking her condition. Well before her death. Long before I ever mentioned to him that she was sick, because the truth was I never had. I hadn't known myself until Margaret told me at the courthouse. I kept my face still. 14 years of training held. But inside, something clicked into place with the finality of a lock turning. Around that same time, Margaret's team uncovered something equally damning on Richard's end. Some of the documents he'd used in his aggressive letters, references to specific account numbers, specific dates tied to Eleanor's trust structure information that simply wasn't public, and that Richard had no legitimate way of accessing unless someone had handed it to him directly. It didn't take much imagining to guess who that someone was. It raised serious questions. Questions about conflicts of interest, about whether Richard had crossed lines that could cost him his license, about whether what we were looking at wasn't just a bitter divorce anymore, but something that edged into conspiracy. I stopped feeling like a victim somewhere in the middle of all this, though I couldn't tell you the exact day it happened. It wasn't dramatic. It was more like waking up gradually and realizing the fear that had been sitting on my chest for weeks had quietly lifted while I wasn't paying attention. I started using a portion of the funds I was legally entitled to draw from the trust, modest amounts carefully documented, to build a legal team of my own people who answered to me, and no one else. I hired a forensic auditor to go through every transaction connected to Daniel over the past 3 years. I began protecting the mansion itself, formalizing security, making sure nothing else disappeared the way I feared it eventually might. But the full $50 million still wasn't mine. Not yet, and it was around this time that Margaret sat me down and told me the second half of Eleanor's condition, the part she said Eleanor had asked her to withhold until I'd proven I could handle the first half with a clear head. Eleanor had established a charitable fund years earlier, quietly without fanfare, supporting women transitioning out of difficult marriages, and more specifically women in military service, who often fell through the cracks of both worlds. The condition was this. I had to protect that fund, actively as part of fulfilling the terms of the will. If I sold the mansion or abandoned the process before the 12 months were up, everything, the estate, the trust, all of it would pass directly to the fund instead of to me. Sitting there, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. This had never only been about money. Eleanor wasn't just testing whether I could survive Daniel and Richard, and whatever they were building against me. She was testing whether I would become the kind of woman she'd always believed I could be. Someone who used strength, not just for her own protection, but for something larger than herself. That understanding was still settling over me a few nights later, when I walked into the study to find the door slightly ajar the way I never left it. The wooden box was still sitting exactly where I'd left it on the desk, but the USB drive, the one that held Eleanor's recorded warning, the one piece of evidence I hadn't yet duplicated, was gone. Fan 6 Su that truck Kong Chong. I didn't panic when I found the USB gone. I want to be honest about why, because it wasn't bravery. Not exactly. It was preparation. Somewhere in the back of my mind, ever since Eleanor's letter had told me not to trust anyone completely, not even the walls of my own house, I'd asked Margaret to make an encrypted digital copy of everything on that drive the very first week I had it. The original sitting in that wooden box had become, without my even fully planning it that way, a kind of bait. Whoever had taken it thought they'd taken the only proof that existed. They were wrong. Still, someone had been inside the mansion. That fact alone kept me up that night, walking through the halls of a house I was still getting used to, calling mine checking locks that were already locked, listening to the old radiators tick and settle, like the building itself was breathing. In the morning, Sam Carter came by, and together we pulled the footage from the security cameras Margaret had quietly installed around the property not long after I'd moved in. A precaution Eleanor herself had apparently requested be arranged the moment the will was finalized. The footage was grainy but usable. A figure face partially obscured, moving through the side entrance late at night, familiar enough with the layout of the house to head straight for the study without hesitation. Sam ran the timestamp against phone records we'd already gathered as part of the broader investigation, and the trail led, not surprisingly anymore, back to someone connected to Richard's office. It wasn't Daniel himself in the footage, but it didn't need to be. The connection was enough. We turned everything over to the authorities at that point. The footage, the encrypted files, the financial records Sam and the forensic accountant had spent weeks assembling. I remember sitting in Margaret's office while she made the calls, feeling strangely calm. The way you feel calm in the middle of a mission, when all the planning finally gives way to execution, and there's nothing left to do but let the process unfold. Daniel, as far as we could tell, still believed the USB theft had worked, that he and Richard had successfully removed the one piece of evidence that could truly hurt them. He grew bolder in the weeks that followed, sending more requests through Richard for financial consideration, framing himself in conversations with mutual acquaintances as a man who'd been left behind by a wife, too consumed with a sudden fortune to remember the years they'd shared. It might have worked on someone who didn't know what I knew. It didn't work on me, and it wouldn't work on the people who were about to see the evidence for themselves. A hearing was eventually scheduled, prompted by the legal complaint Margaret's team filed regarding Richard's conduct and the broader pattern of interference with Eleanor's estate. Daniel showed up looking exactly like a man who still believed he held the better hand. Dressed, sharp, composed, ready to play the part of the wronged husband one more time. I watched him settle into his seat with that same practiced ease he'd carried into our divorce hearing months earlier, and for just a moment, I felt the old flicker of doubt, that small voice asking whether any of this would actually matter, whether people like Daniel simply always found a way to land on their feet. Then my legal team began presenting the evidence, and I watched that composure start to come apart in real time. They laid out the timeline first, the inquiries Daniel had made about Eleanor's health and holdings long before her death, the meetings with Grant Whitfield, the financial ties between Whitfield and Richard's firm. Then came the audio recording, Daniel's own voice filling the room flat and confident, saying that once I got the inheritance, I'd have nowhere left to run. Clear's throat. I watched several people in that room shift in their seats when they heard it. Watched the color drain slightly from Richard's face as he realized exactly how much had been documented, how much he'd allowed himself to believe would never surface. Richard tried to argue procedure, tried to suggest the recordings had been obtained improperly. But Margaret had been meticulous, every step handled within the boundaries of the law. Every piece of evidence gathered in ways that would hold up to exactly this kind of scrutiny. I could see it on his face the moment he understood. There was no clever objection left to make, no version of this hearing where he walked out with his reputation intact. I didn't say much during any of it. I didn't need to. There's a particular kind of satisfaction quieter than I expected, in watching the truth do the work you once thought only anger could do. I'd spent so many nights in the early weeks after the divorce imagining confrontations, imagining the things I'd say to Daniel if I ever got the chance. And none of those imagined speeches came close to the weight of simply sitting still while evidence dismantled his version of events, piece by piece. After the hearing out in the hallway, Daniel caught up to me one more time. Something in his posture had changed. The confidence gone slack, replaced by something almost bewildered, like a man trying to understand how a plan that had seemed so solid could have failed so completely. "Why didn't you just tell me about the inheritance?" he asked, and there was something almost wounded in his voice, as if I owed him an explanation. I looked at him for a long moment before I answered, thinking about Eleanor's letter about the months of quiet work it had taken to get to this exact hallway, this exact conversation. "Because you taught me something," I said. "What?" he asked. "Never give someone the map to the treasure," I said, after they tried to steal your compass. I walked away from him without waiting to see his reaction. I didn't need to see it. For the first time since I'd walked out of that courthouse with nothing, I felt like I was walking towards something instead of away from it. And that difference I was beginning to understand was going to matter more than any number on a bank statement ever could. Fan 7J Eleanor Thuck Suj Lai. The 12 months passed slower than I expected in some ways, and faster than I could have imagined in others. There were quiet mornings in that mansion when I'd walk through rooms Eleanor had once filled with her presence, running my hand along furniture she'd chosen decades earlier, feeling less like an heir moving into someone else's life, and more like a woman slowly growing into the shape of who she was meant to become. There were also hard months. Months of depositions and legal filings, of watching Richard's law license come under formal review, of learning just how far Daniel and Richard had been willing to go before they were finally stopped. But I made it through one deliberate day at a time, the same way I'd made it through deployments, the same way Eleanor, I suspected, had made it through whatever had shaped her, into the woman who built a legal trap this precise, from beyond the grave. When the 12 months finally ended, Margaret sat with me in Eleanor's study, the same room where I'd first opened that wooden box and confirmed that every condition of the will had been met. I had lived in the mansion for the full year. I had protected the charitable fund, not just preserved it, but actually grown it, working with Sam and a small team to expand its reach in ways I don't think even Eleanor had anticipated. The estate transferred to me fully and formally through the trust. Nearly $50 million, a number that still didn't feel entirely real, even as I signed the paperwork that made it official. But I need you to understand that the money wasn't the part that broke me open that day. It was the final letter. Margaret had been holding it per Eleanor's instructions to be delivered only once every condition had been satisfied. Only once she was certain I'd actually walked the entire path rather than simply inherited the destination. I opened it alone that evening, sitting in the same chair where I'd first read her handwriting all those months ago, and this time her words felt less like a warning, and more like an embrace. She wrote that she'd known long before I did, that I would face a moment where it felt like I'd lost everything that mattered. She wrote that she'd lived through her own version of that moment decades earlier. A marriage that had tried to convince her she was worth less than she was, and that watching me walk that same road, even from a distance, even through infrequent phone calls, and the occasional worried instinct, had broken her heart in a way she'd never fully told me while she was alive. She wanted me to understand something specific, something she underlined twice in her careful handwriting. Losing a marriage does not mean losing your worth. She hadn't left me this fortune so that I could punish Daniel, so that I could build some elaborate revenge and call it justice. She'd left it to me, so that I would never again have to make a decision, financial or otherwise, out of fear, so that I would never sit across from a man who wanted to diminish me and feel like I had no choice but to accept it. Daniel in the end lost far more than he gained. Every advantage he tried to claw out of our divorce evaporated once the truth of his conduct came to light. The legal consequences for Richard continued unfolding for months afterward. his firm's reputation collapsing under the weight of what the investigation uncovered: his partnership with Whitfield, exposed in ways that closed doors he'd spent years opening. Daniel, I heard eventually through snorts, the kind of second-hand channels that always seem to carry this news, whether you want them to or not, had moved out of state, starting over in a much smaller life than the one he'd tried to engineer for himself. I think about that moment on the courthouse steps. Sometimes the man who told me I always thought being a soldier made me untouchable, as if that had been an insult, instead of the truest thing anyone had said about me in years. He thought I was walking away with nothing. He had no idea that walking away with nothing was exactly the moment my life actually began. I stood at the window of the mansion on my last evening before the anniversary officially passed, looking out over the Chicago skyline, my old dress uniform hanging pressed and ready in the closet behind me. A photograph of Eleanor sitting on the desk where I could see her every time I looked up from my work. I spoke out loud, even though there was no one else in the room, because some things need to be said even when no one's there to hear them. You were right, Aunt Eleanor, I said. I didn't need revenge. I needed the truth. In the months that followed, I used part of the estate to expand Eleanor's fund, significantly, building it into something that could reach further than either of us had originally imagined. Support for women transitioning out of military service, support for women leaving controlling marriages, emergency financial assistance for military families facing the kind of quiet, invisible hardship that so rarely makes headlines. It felt like the truest way to honor what she'd actually left me. Not the number in the bank account, but the responsibility that came with it. I walked out of that mansion on a clear morning, not long after the first genuinely warm day of spring, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't look back over my shoulder on my way out the door. Daniel had taken almost everything he could get his hands on, but he never touched the one thing that actually mattered. And he never would. The inheritance wasn't the biggest gift my aunt ever gave me. The biggest gift was that I finally understood exactly what I was worth, and no courtroom, no ex-husband, and no amount of betrayal would ever be able to take that away from me again. If this story moved you, I want to know where it found you. Drop a comment below and tell me what part hit you the hardest. Because stories like Lucy's remind us that the people who try to make us feel small rarely understand what we're capable of rebuilding. We've got so many more stories like this one waiting for you. So, make sure you subscribe so you never miss a moment like this. Let's keep this journey going.